352, Chapter 32. Book Talk begins at... Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. I'm your host, Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 352, Nested. Well, hello! It feels like no time at all since I spoke to you. Perhaps it's because it's been no time at all in my world. And in my world, since last time I updated you on the move, absolutely nothing new has happened. However, Gabby, one of our listeners, Gabby H. on Twitter, she pinged me the other night to let me know that unlike the knit a sweater for a penguin debacle scam thing that doesn't really exist, she found an interesting San Francisco area article. The article is called Knitters Answer Wild Care's Call for Nests to Save Baby Birds. These are birds that have been pushed out of a nest or fallen out of a nest or have, for some other reason, lost track of their nest and their mother. And these workers at Wild Cares noticed that they were trying to keep the babies in small bowls and to mimic the size and shape of a nest that way. And then they started noticing that the birds were actually not doing so well in these bowls. These were slick-sided bowls. And I think, if I remember from the article, I read it last week, one of the women who worked and volunteered for this group was a knitter. And she went, "Oh, I know. I'll knit a bowl." And so she did. And it was perfect. And so now people are knitting birdie nests to help save birds baby birds, little tiny baby birds. They're so cute. And before we move on to our book talk, I'm starting to think about our next one. I know it seems strange, right? Like it feels like we just started this book, but no, we're more than halfway through. Yes. And Bleak House, I think we only have 8 chapters left. What? I know, because that's only 900 pages long. How could it have gone by so quickly? We just finished 2 weeks ago, we just finished what would have been the 17th serial. And I swear to you, as many times as I've read and listened to this book, I am still not bored and in love with it. If you are new to CraftLit and don't know about the Bleak House thing, there's a premium subscriber stream and downloading subscriber option that gets you all the audio for Bleak House. And if you stroll way back, it's about a year ago, you will find a sneak peek episode of Bleak House. I think if you search the show notes for sneak peek, or if you go to craftlit.libsyn.com/podcast, which is the prettier Libsyn version of the CraftLit page, and has actually a picture of me in front of a whole lot of books at the top of that page. There's a very well hidden search option in the upper right-hand corner of that picture. Click in there and type in sneak peek. And one of the things that comes out of that search should be the sneak peek for Bleak House. I think there's a sneak peek for Canterville Ghost, which is a short and sweet little book that's in the shop. So that one's shop available. And I think there's a sneak peek for Alice in Wonderland. By the way, Alice in Wonderland, I am remastering right now to make it more audible, similar a little bit, and clean up some of the audio now that we have the new and better way to master and clean up the audio. I'm slowly trying to go back through time. I'm still working on Dracula, which is a lot. And anybody who already purchased Alice in Wonderland, whether it's the MP3 version or the video version and the MP3 version, I will be sending you a link to the newer version to download. So that will be coming to you as soon as Alice is fixed. And as we head into talk about our North and South chapter, I wanted to share with you my most recent zeitgeist moment. There have been many, actually. I haven't kept track of all of them because a lot of them happened during the move, where oh-so-Gaskell came up, or North and South came up, or the name Margaret Hale came up, and I couldn't remember all of them, and I couldn't keep track of them all because I didn't always have paper near me. But I went for a walk the other day while I was stuck on a particularly thorny problem in some of this curriculum that I'd been working on. And I haven't spent a whole lot of time walking around our new neighborhood, and it's fairly rural out here, so walking anywhere is walking a long distance in green and not very much else. And so I was walking back from, seeing horses and violets and all sorts of fabulous things in people's fields. And I saw the backside of an hysterical marker. And I thought, ooh, I could learn something. So I walked around to the front and I looked up, and this is what it says on the placard. Historic District, known as Milltown, 1727, and later Milton, 1804, named Carversville, 1833. Historic Carversville Society, established 1971. So, dudes, I am living in Milton. What are the chances? I mean, seriously, what are the chances? This is ridiculous. If all of us had nickels for every time there has been a kind of zeitgeist moment for us, can you imagine how wealthy we would all be at this point? Oh my gosh. Loads of money, we'd be rolling in dough. It's just fabulous. But we have a chapter to get to. And I promised you, last week's chapter was going to be kind of and this week's chapter was going to be better. So let's get to it. Well, first, part of the reason why this week's chapter is so great is that it's 3 chapters. I had originally thought, I'll just do a quick podcast. And then I realized, no, I really can't do that to you because stuff happens. And, it's one of those situations where once the momentum starts, it would be the chapters where if you were reading this book in bed at night, you would finish chapter 32 and say, well, that wasn't very long. And then you would flip ahead and you'd say, the next chapter's not very long either. And by that time, you're hooked and there's nothing you can do about it. You're going to have to keep reading. And if you were in bed, you probably would even go past chapter 34 where we're stopping today. But I didn't want to belabor it too much and make an hour-and-a-half long podcast. So, chapter 32 is called Mischances, not Missed Chances, M-I-S-S-E-D, but M-I-S-C-H-A-N-C-E-S. Chapter 33 is called Peace, and chapter 34 is called False and True. And if you recall where we left off at the end of the last chapter, Frederick has decided that he will, in fact, leave in a hurry to avoid this nasty Leonard's guy from the South who knows what he looks like, or at least looked like, and who would just love to get his hands on the reward money. Margaret has also figured out that she can probably leverage her relationship with Henry Lennox to get Frederick some honest legal advice. So, yay, there's hope that this situation may not last forever. And Frederick has let it be known that he is in love with a nice Catholic girl in Spain and really wants them to come visit and meet her and her black hair, her fabulous raven hair. And that's where we left off. And this chapter, Gaskell went back into the text after it was published in Household Words, and she added these little epigrams at the beginning, quotations that she's selected from various poems and books and things like that. And the one at the beginning of this, there's a footnote on it. The quote is not all that particularly interesting. It's, again, first chapter we're doing today is called Mischances, and the quotation is, what? Remain to be denounced, dragged it may be in chains? And this, I thought, wow, that's kind of a dramatic opening. This was written by Byron, Lord Byron, and the preface of this particular text says that this was a poetic drama, quote, neither adapted nor in any shape intended for the stage. because Byron, that man cracks me up. Someday I will really put my nose to the grindstone and we will do some epic tome that Byron wrote. Because he's not He's not always funny, ha-ha, but he is always dry, witty, charmingly, rakishly funny. And that preface commentary gives you a slight piece of what it's like to read Byron. So in this chapter, we now have to get Frederick out. We have to get him out. We know Leonard's is lurking. And the process of getting him on a train is a little tricky, right? Because you have to go in and buy a ticket. And he can't do that because that would put him out in public in light. Even if they go at nighttime, the oil lamps will be lit in the station. So Margaret's going to have to go in. Margaret's going to have to go get the ticket. Margaret's going to have to also be out in public at night. Now, I found the discussion in this chapter to be fabulous for a couple of reasons. One is everyone's attitude towards Margaret, and the other is Margaret's attitude towards Margaret. I think Gaskell had to walk a fairly delicate line on this one because we know Margaret is completely capable of handling anything at this point that life has thrown at her. I mean, everything has gone wrong. She's lost Bessie. She's lost her mother. She's losing her brother again. And her father's useless. And she's the one who's had to do everything for so long. But one of the things we really haven't seen her do in actual text, it's been alluded to, we've heard talk about it, is we haven't really seen her participate in commerce or any kind of actual transaction. And occasionally in Jane Austen books or occasionally in Dickens or other texts of the time, occasionally you see people going into shops and you kind of hear the shop talk and you get some idea of how women bought fabric or how you bought dry goods. And these are things that are so distant from us, certainly in the United States and even in other countries that I've visited. I suppose Italy came the closest for me to some of these, in some ways, more personable ways of conducting business, because in the United States, so much is put out on the shelves and you just go get what you want and take it up to a counter and somebody checks you out, or now you can even check yourself out. But in Italy and in a lot of these older books, you have a certain amount of conversation that goes on because everything is behind the counter. If you've watched Selfridges on PBS, you see the same thing. Everything's kept behind the counter. And in fact, moving stuff away from the counter and out where people could look at it, or ready-to-wear clothes were out and available for you to look at and touch and see in person, closer to you than behind the counter. That was all very new. Well, Margaret's going to have to go buy a train ticket for Frederick. So they have to figure out how to accomplish that. That's one of the things that's going to have to happen. But in the process of doing that, I learned a little bit about how the trains ran and how the train stations were organized. So listen for that, because I thought it was it's just, little throwaway stuff, but I'm always fascinated by that. And I just recently watched, for the first time, which is an embarrassment, I know, The Station Agent, which if you haven't seen, it's a strange little film. It's a lovely little film. Peter Dinklage, who now everybody knows from Game of Thrones. It was, I think, the first, not his first movie by a long shot, but I think it was the first movie that really made him a known quantity. And I didn't know this in advance, but I guess the part was written for him by the writer-director. They're friends from way back. And so you kind of get the sense that there's some real Peter Dinklage going on in that film, but he has some conversations with other characters about how these little stations were run by the station agents on train lines. And it's a whole world that we've just lost in so many ways, at least in the United States. I know there's train travel in other countries is still just as dominant as it used to be, but we've lost a lot of that here, unfortunately. So chapter 32 is just this little, dealing with this little problem. And you're going to hear the word vaults, V-A-U-L-T-S, referring to a pub or a beer house, a place to go and get a drink. So that's chapter 32, getting Frederick out. Chapter 33 then is coming back, and and having to deal with the empty, which is hard. And I don't know if you recall a throwaway line that Mr. Hale wanted Margaret to write to Mr. Bell. It's been a while since we've talked about Mr. Bell. Mr. Bell was, we just learned, Mr. Hale's groomsman at his wedding. So Mr. Bell goes way back. They were friends at Oxford. They've known each other forever. And Mr. Bell has a connection to Milton. That's how Mr. Hale found out about Milton in the first place. So we have this kind of circular connection between the Hales, Bell, Milton, back to Hale, back to Bell, back to Milton. And so now as we come back to regular life after Frederick, Mr. Bell needs to be involved because Mr. Hale wanted him to accompany him to the funeral. Part of the reason why that was a discussion is because Mr. Hale says he can't do it by himself, and Margaret can't go. It was a class thing. Victorian era women of their class just didn't go to funerals. And yet, listen to Margaret. Margaret, who was absolutely freaked out about seeing Bessie laid out after she passed away. Listen to Margaret in chapter 33. It's kind of marvelous. A term that has popped up in this book quite a few times and pops up again, but it's been a while since we talked about it, is fustian clothes. These are basically hard-wearing fabrics, linsey-woolsey, more textured, knobby kinds of fabrics that would have been less expensive. So there's that. And then there's a reference to a song by Sting. No, there is a reference to something that I first heard of in a song by Sting. I think it's Wrapped Around Your Finger. Anyway, the line is, he was in the Charybdis of passion. And Charybdis, if you've never seen this thing spelled, is Charybdis. Scylla and Charybdis, Scylla spelled Scylla. Scylla was a rocky shore, a place where if you tried to sail your ship near, you would run aground on the rocks. And Charybdis was a whirlpool. And so this is the quintessential stuck between a rock and a hard place thing. And it's been said many, many thousands of years, many different ways. Charybdis and Scylla, or as Sting said, caught between the Scylla and Charybdis. This is just one way of saying it. So here she's using it differently, though. Instead of a caught between a rock and a hard place, she's saying he was in the Charybdis of passion, meaning he's in a whirlpool of passion, which is kind of cool. It's a nice way to say it. And that brings you to the end of chapter 33, then chapter 34. There's one kind of interesting throwaway line that I never would have looked at twice, but there's a footnote about it. Margaret will say that the Sunday Post intervened and interfered with their London letters. This is because the post office at this time in history was remarkable for being on time and prompt. But there was talk right around this time in I think it was in Parliament. There were certainly agitators saying nothing should be done on Sunday. Mail shouldn't be delivered. People shouldn't be working and delivering mail. But it wasn't a done deal. It hadn't been signed into law yet. So somebody interfering with their mail and preventing the post from arriving is what Margaret's talking about. Then there's also another one of those throwaway lines. It's just a line of dialogue about a Cornish trick. And at first I thought this was something like, oh, this is going to be something like welshing on a bet. And no, not even a little bit. Cornishmen were evidently famous for being good wrestlers, and a Cornish trick was a way to throw someone down. I think of it kind of like Cornish Taekwondo. So that's all that is. And with that, I'm going to launch you into listening to these 3 chapters back to back. I'll catch you on the flip side.
Chapter 32. Mischances. What? Remain to be denounced? Dragged it may be in chains? Werner. All the next day they sat together, they three. Mr. Hale hardly ever spoke but when his children asked him questions and forced him, as it were, into the present. Frederick's grief was no more to be seen or heard. The first paroxysm had passed over, and now he was ashamed of having been so battered down by emotion, and though his sorrow for the loss of his mother was a deep, real feeling, and would last out his life, it was never to be spoken of again. Margaret, not so passionate at first, was more suffering now. At times she cried a good deal, and her manner, even when speaking on indifferent things, had a mournful tenderness about it, which was deepened whenever her looks fell on Frederick, and she thought of his rapidly approaching departure. She was glad he was going on her father's account, however much she might grieve over it on her own. The anxious terror in which Mr. Hale lived lest his son should be detected and captured far outweighed the pleasure he derived from his presence. The nervousness had increased since Mrs. Hale's death, probably because he dwelt upon it more exclusively. He started at every unusual sound, and was never comfortable unless Frederick sat out of the immediate view of anyone entering the room. Towards evening he said, "You will go with Frederick to the station, Margaret? I shall want to know he is safely off. You will bring me word that he is clear of Milton, at any rate?" "Certainly," said Margaret. "I shall like it if you won't be lonely without me, Papa." "No, no. I should always be fancying someone had known him and that he had been stopped, unless you could tell me you had seen him off. And go to the Outwood station. It is quite as near, and not so many people about. Take a cab there. There is less risk of his being seen." "What time is your train, Fred?" 10 minutes past 6, very nearly dark. So, what will you do, Margaret?" "Oh, I can manage. I am getting very brave and very hard. It is a well-lighted road all the way home if it should be dark. But I was out last week much later." Margaret was thankful when the parting was over, the parting from the dead mother and the living father. She hurried Frederick into the cab in order to shorten a scene which she saw was so bitterly painful to her father, who would accompany his son as he took his last look at his mother. Partly in consequence of this, and partly owing to one of the very common mistakes in the railway guide as to the times when trains arrive at the smaller stations, they found, on reaching Outwood, that they had nearly 20 minutes to spare. The booking office was not open, so they could not even take the ticket. They accordingly went down the flight of steps that led to the level of the ground below the railway. There was a broad cinder path diagonally crossing a field which lay alongside of the carriage road, and they went there to walk backwards and forwards for the few minutes they had to spare. Margaret's hand lay in Frederick's arm. He took hold of it affectionately. "Margaret, I am going to consult Mr. Lennox as to the chance of exculpating myself, so that I may return to England whenever I choose, more for your sake than for the sake of anyone else. I can't bear to think of your lonely position if anything should happen to my father. He looks sadly changed, terribly shaken. I wish you could get him to think of the Cadiz plan for many reasons. What could you do if he were taken away? You have no friend near. We are curiously bare of relations." Margaret could hardly keep from crying at the tender anxiety with which Frederick was bringing before her an event which she herself felt was not very improbable, so severely had the cares of the last few months told upon Mr. Hale. But she tried to rally as she said, "There have been such strange, unexpected changes in my life during these last 2 years that I feel more than ever that it is not worth while to calculate too closely what I should do if any future event took place. I try to think only upon the present." She paused. They were standing still for a moment, close on the field side of the stile leading into the road. The setting sun fell on their faces. Frederick held her hand in his, and looked with wistful anxiety into her face, reading there more care and trouble than she would betray by words. She went on. "We shall write often to one another, and I will promise, for I see it will set your mind at ease, to tell you every worry I have. Papa is—" She started a little, a hardly visible start, but Frederick felt the sudden motion of the hand he held and turned his full face to the road, along which a horseman was slowly riding, just passing the very stile where they stood. Margaret bowed. Her bow was stiffly returned. "Who is that?" said Frederick, almost before he was out of hearing. Margaret was a little drooping, a little flushed as she replied, "Mr. Thornton. You saw him before, you know." "Only his back. He is an unprepossessing-looking fellow. What a scowl he has." "Something has happened to vex him," said Margaret apologetically. "You would not have thought him unprepossessing if you had seen him with Mamma." "I fancy it must be time to go and take my ticket. If I had known how dark it would be, we wouldn't have sent back the cab, Margaret." "Oh, don't fidget about that. I can take a cab here if I like, or go back by the railroad, when I should have shops and people and lamps all the way from the Milton station house. Don't think of me. Take care of yourself. I am sick with the thought that Leonard's may be in the same train with you. Look well into the carriage before you get in." They went back to the station. Margaret insisted upon going into the full light of the flaring gas inside to take the ticket. Some idle-looking young men were lounging about with the station-master. Margaret thought she had seen the face of one of them before, and returned him a proud look of offended dignity for his somewhat impertinent stare of undisguised admiration. She went hastily to her brother, who was standing outside, and took hold of his arm. "Have you got your bag? Let us walk about here on the platform," said she, a little flurried at the idea of so soon being left alone, and her bravery oozing out rather faster than she liked to acknowledge even to herself. She heard a step following them along the flags. It stopped when they stopped, looking out along the line and hearing the whiz of the coming train. They did not speak. Their hearts were too full. Another moment, and the train would be here. A minute more, and he would be gone. Margaret almost repented the urgency with which she had entreated him to go to London. It was throwing more chances of detection in his way. If he had sailed for Spain by Liverpool, he might have been off in 2 or 3 hours. Frederick turned round, right facing the lamp, where the gas darted up in vivid anticipation of the train. A man in the dress of a railway porter started forward, a bad-looking man who seemed to have drunk himself into a state of brutality, although his senses were in perfect order. "By your leave, miss," said he, pushing Margaret rudely on one side and seizing Frederick by the collar. "Your name is Ale, I believe?" In an instant, how, Margaret did not see, for everything danced before her eyes, but by some sleight of wrestling Frederick had tripped him up, and he fell from the height of 3 or 4 feet, which the platform was elevated above the space of soft ground by the side of the railroad. There he lay. "Run! Run!" gasped Margaret. "The train is here. It was Leonard's, was it? Oh, run! I will carry your bag." And she took him by the arm to push him along with all her feeble force. A door was opened in a carriage. He jumped in, and as he leant out to say, "God bless you, Margaret," the train rushed past her, and she was left standing alone. She was so terribly sick and faint that she was thankful to be able to turn into the ladies' waiting room and sit down for an instant. At first, she could do nothing but gasp for breath. It was such a hurry, such a sickening alarm, such a near chance. If the train had not been there at the moment, the man would have jumped up again and called for assistance to arrest him. She wondered if the man had got up. She tried to remember if she had seen him move. She wondered if he could have been seriously hurt. She ventured out. The platform was all alight, but still quite deserted. She went to the end and looked over, somewhat fearfully. No one was there, and then she was glad she had made herself go and inspect, for otherwise terrible thoughts would have haunted her dreams. And even as it was, she was so trembling and affrighted that she felt she could not walk home along the road, which did indeed seem lonely and dark as she gazed down upon it from the blaze of the station. She would wait until the down train passed and take her seat in it. But what if Leonards recognized her as Frederick's companion? She peered about before venturing into the booking office to take her ticket. There were only some railway officials standing about and talking loud to one another. "So Leonards has been drinking again," said one, seemingly in authority. "He'll need all his boasted influence to keep his place this time." "Where is he?" asked another, while Margaret, her back towards them, was counting her change with trembling fingers, not daring to turn round till she heard the answer to this question. "I don't know. He came in not 5 minutes ago with some long story or other about a fall he'd had, swearing awfully, and wanted to borrow some money from me to go to London by the next up train. He made all sorts of tipsy promises, but I had something else to do than listen to him. I told him to go about his business, and he went off at the front door." "He's at the nearest vault, I'll be bound," said the first speaker. "Your money would have gone there too, if you'd been such a fool as to lend it." "Catch me. I knew better what his London meant. Why, he has never paid me off that 5 shillings. And so they went on. And now all Margaret's anxiety was for the train to come. She hid herself once more in the ladies' waiting room and fancied every noise was Leonard's step, every loud and boisterous voice was his. But no one came near her until the train drew up, when she was civilly helped into a carriage by a porter, into whose face she durst not look until they were in motion. Chapter 33. Peace. Sleep on, my love, in thy cold bed, never to be disquieted. My last good night, thou wilt not wake till I thy fate shall overtake. Dr. King. Home seemed unnaturally quiet after all this terror and noisy commotion. Her father had seen all due preparation made for her refreshment on her return, and then sat down again in his accustomed chair to fall into one of his sad waking dreams. Dixon had got Mary Higgins to scold and direct in the kitchen, and her scolding was not the less energetic because it was delivered in an angry whisper, for, speaking above her breath, she would have thought irreverent, as long as there was anyone dead lying in the house. Margaret had resolved not to mention the crowning and closing affright to her father. There was no use in speaking about it. It had ended well. The only thing to be feared was lest Leonards should in some way borrow money enough to effect his purpose of following Frederick to London and hunting him out there. But there were immense chances against the success of any such plan, and Margaret determined not to torment herself by thinking of what she could do nothing to prevent. Frederick would be as much on his guard as she could put him, and in a day or two at most he would be safely out of England. "I suppose we shall hear from Mr. Bell tomorrow," said Margaret. "Yes," replied her father. "I suppose so." "If he can come, he will be here tomorrow evening, I should think." "If he cannot come, I shall ask Mr. Thornton to go with me to the funeral. I cannot go alone. I shall break down utterly." "Don't ask Mr. Thornton, Papa. Let me go with you," said Margaret impetuously. "You? My dear, women do not generally go." "No, because they can't control themselves. Women of our class don't go because they have no power over their emotions and yet are ashamed of showing them. Poor women go and don't care if they are seen overwhelmed with grief. But I promise you, Papa, that if you will let me go, I will be no trouble. Don't have a stranger and leave me out. Dear Papa, if Mr. Bell cannot come, I shall go. I won't urge my wish against your will if he does." Mr. Bell could not come. He had the gout. It was a most affectionate letter, and expressed great and true regret for his inability to attend. He hoped to come and pay them a visit soon, if they would have him. His Milton property required some looking after, and his agent had written to him to say that his presence was absolutely necessary, or else he had avoided coming near Milton as long as he could. And now the only thing that would reconcile him to this necessary visit was the idea that he should see and might possibly be able to comfort his old friend. Margaret had all the difficulty in the world to persuade her father not to invite Mr. Thornton. She had an indescribable repugnance to this step being taken. The night before the funeral came a stately note from Mrs. Thornton to Miss Hale, saying that, at her son's desire, their carriage should attend the funeral if it would not be disagreeable to the family. Margaret tossed the note to her father. "Oh, don't let us have these forms," said she. "Let us go alone, you and me, Papa. They don't care for us, or else he would have offered to go himself and not have proposed this sending an empty carriage." "I thought you were so extremely averse to his going, Margaret," said Mr. Hale in some surprise. "And so I am. I don't want him to come at all, and I should especially dislike the idea of our asking him. But this seems such a mockery of mourning that I did not expect it from him." She startled her father by bursting into tears. She had been so subdued in her grief, so thoughtful for others, so gentle and patient in all things, that he could not understand her impatient ways tonight. She seemed agitated and restless, and at all the tenderness which her father in his turn now lavished upon her, she only cried the more. She passed so bad a night that she was ill-prepared for the additional anxiety caused by a letter received from Frederick. Mr. Lennox was out of town. His clerk said that he would return by the following Tuesday at the latest, that he might possibly be at home on Monday. Consequently, after some consideration, Frederick had determined upon remaining in London a day or two longer. He had thought of coming down to Milton again. The temptation had been very strong, but the idea of Mr. Bell domesticated in his father's house, and the alarm he had received at the last moment at the railway station, had made him resolve to stay in London. Margaret might be assured he would take every precaution against being tracked by Leonards. Margaret was thankful that she received this letter while her father was absent in her mother's room. If he had been present, he would have expected her to read it aloud to him, and it would have raised in him a state of nervous alarm which she would have found it impossible to soothe away. There was not merely the fact, which disturbed her excessively, of Frederick's detention in London, but there were allusions to the recognition at the last moment at Milton, and the possibility of a pursuit, which made her blood run cold. And how, then, would it have affected her father? Many a time did Margaret repent of having suggested and urged on the plan of consulting Mr. Lennox. At the moment it had seemed as if it would occasion so little delay, add so little to the apparently small chances of detection, and yet everything that had since occurred had tended to make it so undesirable. Margaret battled hard against this regret of hers for what could not now be helped, this self-reproach for having said what had at the time appeared to be wise, but which after events were proving to have been so foolish. But her father was in too depressed a state of mind and body to struggle healthily. He would succumb to all these causes for morbid regret over what could not be recalled. Margaret summoned up all her forces to her aid. Her father seemed to have forgotten that they had any reason to expect a letter from Frederick that morning. He was absorbed in one idea. that the last visible token of the presence of his wife was to be carried away from him and hidden from his sight. He trembled pitifully as the undertaker's man was arranging his crepe draperies around him. He looked wistfully at Margaret, and, when released, he tottered towards her, murmuring, "Pray for me, Margaret. I have no strength left in me. I cannot pray. I give her up because I must. I try to bear it. Indeed I do. I know it is God's will. But I cannot see why she died. Pray for me, Margaret, that I may have faith to pray. It is a great strait, my child." Margaret sat by him in the coach, almost supporting him in her arms, and repeating all the noble verses of holy comfort or texts expresses of faithful resignation that she could remember. Her voice never faltered, and she herself gained strength by doing this. Her father's lips moved after her, repeating the well-known texts as her words suggested them. It was terrible to see the patient struggling effort to obtain the resignation which he had not strength to take into his heart as a part of himself. Margaret's fortitude nearly gave way as Dixon, with a slight motion of her hand, directed her notice to Nicholas Higgins and his daughter, standing a little aloof, but deeply attentive to the ceremonial. Nicholas wore his usual fustian clothes, but had a bit of black stuff sewn round his hat, a mark of mourning which he had never shown to his daughter Bessie's memory. But Mr. Hale saw nothing. He went on repeating to himself, mechanically as it were, all the funeral service as it was read by the officiating clergyman. He sighed twice or thrice when all was ended, and then, putting his hand on Margaret's arm, he mutely entreated to be led away, as if he were blind and she his faithful guide. Dixon sobbed aloud. She covered her face with her handkerchief, and was so absorbed in her own grief that she did not perceive that the crowd, attracted on such occasions, was dispersing, till she was spoken to by someone close at hand. It was Mr. Thornton. He had been present all the time, standing with bent head behind a group of people so that, in fact, no one had recognized him. "I beg your pardon, but can you tell me how Mr. Ale is, and Miss Ale, too? I should like to know how they both are."
"Of course, sir. They are much as is to be expected. Master is terribly broke down. Miss Ale bears up better'n likely."
Mr. Thornton would rather have heard that she was suffering the natural sorrow. In the first place, there was selfishness enough in him to have taken pleasure in the idea that his great love might come in to comfort and console her, much the same kind of strange, passionate pleasure which comes stinging through a mother's heart when her drooping infant nestles close to her and is dependent upon her for everything. But this delicious vision of what might have been, in which, in spite of all Margaret's repulse, he would have indulged only a few days ago, was miserably disturbed by the recollection of what he had seen near the Outwood station. Miserably disturbed? That is not strong enough. He was haunted by the remembrance of the handsome young man with whom she stood in an attitude of such familiar confidence, and the remembrance shot through him like an agony, till it made him clench his hands tight in order to subdue the pain. At that late hour, so far from home, it took a great moral effort to galvanize his trust, erewhile so perfect in Margaret's pure and exquisite maidenliness, into life. As soon as the effort ceased, his trust dropped down dead and powerless, and all sorts of wild fancies chased each other like dreams through his mind. Here was a little piece of miserable gnawing confirmation. She bore up better than likely under this grief. She had, then, some hope to look to, so bright that even in her affectionate nature it could come in to lighten the dark hours of a daughter newly made motherless. Yes, He knew how she would love. He had not loved her without gaining that instinctive knowledge of what capabilities were in her. Her soul would walk in glorious sunlight if any man was worthy, by his power of loving, to win back her love. Even in her mourning she would rest with a peaceful faith upon his sympathy. His sympathy. Whose? That other man's. And that it was another was enough to make Mr. Thornton's pale grave face grow doubly wan and stern at Dixon's answer. "I suppose I may call," said he coldly. "On Mr. Ale, I mean. He will perhaps admit me after tomorrow or so." He spoke as if the answer were a matter of indifference to him, but it was not so. For all his pain, he longed to see the author of it. Although he hated Margaret at times, when he thought of that gentle, familiar attitude and all the attendant circumstances, he had a restless desire to renew her picture in his mind, a longing for the very atmosphere she breathed. He was in the Charybdis of passion, and must perforce circle and circle ever nearer round the fatal centre.
"I dare say master will see you. He was very sorry to have to deny you the other day, but circumstances was not agreeable just then."
For some reason or other, Dixon never named this interview that she had had with Mr. Thornton to Margaret. It might have been mere chance, but so it was that Margaret never heard that he had attended her poor mother's funeral. Chapter 34. False and True. Truth will fail thee never, never. Though thy bark be tempest-driven, though each plank be rent and riven, truth will bear thee on forever. Anonymous. The bearing up better than likely was a terrible strain upon Margaret. Sometimes she thought she must give way and cry out with pain as the sudden sharp thought came across her, even during her apparently cheerful conversations with her father, that she had no longer a mother. About Frederick, too, there was great uneasiness. The Sunday post intervened and interfered with their London letters, and on Tuesday Margaret was surprised and disheartened to find that there was still no letter. She was quite in the dark as to his plans, and her father was miserable at all this uncertainty. It broke in upon his lately acquired habit of sitting still in one easy chair for half a day together. He kept pacing up and down the room, then out of it, and she heard him upon the landing opening and shutting the bedroom doors without any apparent object. She tried to tranquilize him by reading aloud, but it was evident he could not listen for long together. How thankful she was then that she had to keep to herself the additional cause for anxiety produced by their encounter with Leonard's. She was thankful to hear Mr. Thornton announced. His visit would force her father's thoughts into another channel. He came up straight to her father, whose hands he took and wrung without a word, holding them in his for a minute or two, during which time his face, his eyes, his look, told of more sympathy than could be put into words. Then he turned to Margaret. Not better than likely did she look. Her stately beauty was dimmed with much watching and with many tears. The expression on her countenance was of gentle, patient sadness, nay, of positive present suffering. He had not meant to greet her otherwise than with his late-studied coldness of demeanour, but he could not help going up to her, as she stood a little aside, rendered timid by the uncertainty of his manner of late, and saying the few necessary commonplace words in so tender a voice that her eyes filled with tears, and she turned away to hide her emotion. She took her work and sat down very quiet and silent. Mr. Thornton's heart beat quick and strong, and for the time he utterly forgot the Outwood Lane. He tried to talk to Mr. Hale, and his presence, always a certain kind of pleasure to Mr. Hale, as his power and decision made him and his opinions a safe shore port, was unusually agreeable to her father, as Margaret saw. Presently Dixon came to the door and said,
"Miss Hale, you are wanted."
Dixon's manner was so flurried that Margaret turned sick at heart. Something had happened to Fred. She had no doubt of that. It was well that her father and Mr. Thornton were so much occupied by their conversation.
"What is it, Dixon?"
asked Margaret the moment she had shut the drawing-room door.
"Come this way, miss,"
said Dixon, opening the door of what had been Mrs. Hale's bedchamber, now Margaret's, for her father refused to sleep there again after his wife's death.
"It's nothing, miss,"
said Dixon, choking a little.
"Only a police inspector. He wants to see you, miss, but I dare say it's about nothing at all."
"Did he name?" asked Margaret, almost inaudibly.
"No, miss, he named nothing. He only asked if you lived here, and if he could speak to you. Martha went to the door and let him in. She's shown him into the master's study. I went to him myself to try if that would do, but no, it's you, miss, he wants."
Margaret did not speak again till her hand was on the lock of the study door. Here she turned round and said, "Take care Papa does not come down. Mr. Thornton is with him now." The inspector was almost daunted by the haughtiness of her manner as she entered. There was something of indignation expressed in her countenance, but so kept down and controlled that it gave her a superb air of disdain. There was no surprise, no curiosity. She stood awaiting the opening of his business there. Not a question did she ask. "I beg your pardon, ma'am, but my duty obliges me to ask you a few plain questions. A man has died at the infirmary in consequence of a fall received at Outwood Station between the hours of 5 and 6 on Thursday evening, the 26th instant. At the time, this fall did not seem of much consequence, but it was rendered fatal, the doctors say, by the presence of some internal complaint and the man's own habit of drinking." The large, dark eyes gazing straight into the inspector's face dilated a little. Otherwise, there was no motion perceptible to his experienced observation. Her lips swelled out into a richer curve than ordinary, owing to the enforced tension of the muscles, but he did not know what was their usual appearance, so as to recognize the unwonted sullen defiance of the firm sweeping lines. She never blanched or trembled. She fixed him with her eye. Now, as he paused before going on, she said, almost as if she would encourage him in telling his tale, "Well, go on." "It is supposed that an inquest will have to be held. There is some slight evidence to prove that the blow or push or scuffle that caused the fall was provoked by this poor fellow's half-tipsy impertinence to a young lady walking with the man who pushed the deceased over the edge of the platform. This much was observed by someone on the platform who, however, thought no more about the matter, as the blow seemed of slight consequence. There is also some reason to identify the lady with yourself, in which case—" "I was not there," said Margaret, still keeping her expressionless eyes fixed on his face with the unconscious look of a sleepwalker. The inspector bowed, but did not speak. The lady standing before him showed no emotion, no fluttering fear, no anxiety, no desire to end the interview. The information he had received was very vague. One of the porters rushing out to be in readiness for the train had seen a scuffle at the other end of the platform between Leonard's and a gentleman accompanied by a lady, but heard no noise, and before the train had got to its full speed after starting, he had been almost knocked down by the headlong run of the enraged, half-intoxicated Leonards, swearing and cursing awfully. He had not thought any more about it, till his evidence was routed out by the inspector, who, on making some farther inquiry at the railroad station, had heard from the station master that a young lady and gentleman had been there about that hour. The lady, remarkably handsome, and said by some grocer's assistant present at the time to be a Miss Hale living at Crampton, whose family dealt at his shop. There was no certainty that the one lady and gentleman were identical with the other pair, but there was great probability. Leonards himself had gone, half mad with rage and pain, to the nearest gin palace for comfort, and his tipsy words had not been attended to by the busy waiters there. They, however, remembered his starting up and cursing himself for not having sooner thought of the electric telegraph for some purpose unknown, and they believed that he left with the idea of going there. On his way, overcome by pain or drink, he had lain down in the road, where the police had found him and taken him to the infirmary. There he had never recovered sufficient consciousness to give any distinct account of his fall, although once or twice he had had glimmerings of sense sufficient to make the authorities send for the nearest magistrate, in hopes that he might be able to take down the dying man's deposition of the cause of his death. But when the magistrate had come, he was rambling about being at sea, and mixing up names of captains and lieutenants in an indistinct manner with those of his fellow porters at the railway. And his last words were a curse on the Cornish trick, which had, he said, made him £100 poorer than he ought to have been. The inspector ran all this over in his mind. The vagueness of the evidence to prove that Margaret had been at the station. The unflinching, calm denial which she gave to such a supposition. She stood, awaiting his next word with a composure that appeared supreme. "Then, madame, I have your denial that you were the lady accompanying the gentleman who struck the blow or gave the push which caused the death of this poor man." A quick, sharp pain went through Margaret's brain. "Oh, God, that I knew Frederick was safe!" A deep observer of human countenances might have seen the momentary agony shoot out of her great gloomy eyes, like the torture of some creature brought to bay. But the inspector, though very keen, was not a very deep observer. He was a little struck, notwithstanding, by the form of the answer, which sounded like a mechanical repetition of her first reply, not changed and modified in shape so as to meet his last question. "I was not there," said she, slowly and heavily. And all this time she never closed her eyes or ceased from that glassy, dreamlike stare. His quick suspicions were aroused by this dull echo of her former denial. It was as if she had forced herself to one untruth and had been stunned out of all power of varying it. He put up his book of notes in a very deliberate manner. Then he looked up. She had not moved any more than if she had been some great Egyptian statue. "I hope you will not think me impertinent when I say that I may have to call on you again. I may have to summon you to appear on the inquest and prove an alibi if my witnesses—" It was but one who had recognized her. "Persist in deposing to your presence at the unfortunate event." He looked at her sharply. She was still perfectly quiet. No change of color or darker shadow of guilt on her proud face. He thought to have seen her wince. He did not know Margaret Hale. He was a little abashed by her regal composure. It must have been a mistake of identity. He went on. "'Tis very unlikely, ma'am, that I shall have to do anything of the kind. I hope you will excuse me for doing what is only my duty, although it may appear impertinent." Margaret bowed her head as he went towards the door. Her lips were stiff and dry. She could not speak even the common words of farewell. But suddenly she walked forwards and opened the study door and preceded him to the door of the house, which she threw wide open for his exit. She kept her eyes upon him in the same dull, fixed manner until he was fairly out of the house. She shut the door and went halfway into the study, then turned back as if moved by some passionate impulse, and locked the door inside. Then she went into the study, paused, tottered forward, paused again, swayed for an instant where she stood, and fell prone on the floor in a dead swoon.
Okay, I think Margaret deserves that swoon. You know, sometimes the swoons, you look at them and you go, really? I mean, I know corsets and difficulty breathing and all that stuff. Right, I get it. I think she's allowed to own this one. I would have been terrified. Can you imagine? She's never watched CSI. She's never seen Law and Order. She's never, which, by the way, in our family we call Law and Ordover, because my father-in-law and mother-in-law are both lawyers. So that's my little sidebar comment. But, right? I mean, Margaret's gotten caught. Somebody recognized her for real. And she's totally perjuring herself. I guess she's not really perjuring herself because she's not under oath, but whoa, she's lying. She's lying through her teeth to a man and a professional and a officer of the law. And if an officer of the law is involved, who else knows about this? Oh, right, Mr. Thornton is the magistrate. So, uh-oh. And poor Mr. Thornton. Dixon didn't even tell Margaret. Now, do you think that was on purpose? Or do you think that's Dixon being forgetful? I don't know. I don't know that I have an opinion yet about that, but maybe you do, and you'd like to share. Let us know. Because Dixon's becoming an interesting character. She has been an interesting character for a while, but that one sin of omission I thought was interesting. And I loved the description of how Mr. Thornton was hoping that Margaret wasn't bearing up so well, so that it would be his love that could sustain her during her hour of need. But yeah, no, not so much, because she's doing just fine. Thanks. Bye. And yet she's not. She's really not. This has been a lot. This has been way too much for anyone. And I think a lot of us have been there in that position where you just kind of look at the sky and say, dear God in heaven, why this also? You know, one more thing. I cannot believe one more thing. But you do, you pick up, you keep going. And of course, the real news, anyway, at the end of that, is that we find out that the guy who was such a jerk died. Which is interesting because at first, when I first read this chapter, I thought, movie wasting disease, little too convenient to have him die. And then I thought, no, actually, concussive head injuries being what they are, and what they are is really bad. I don't know if the information has gone anywhere outside of the United States because a lot of it has been in discussions of American football, not the rest of the world football, what we call soccer here. Because like the metric system, we call it soccer and football. The end. So with American football, there's been a lot of discussion lately about children playing and the concussive head injuries that these young men and women, when they play, these young girls, can sustain. And when I was a freshman in high school, we had an excellent football team. I think I've mentioned on the podcast before that it was Friday Night Lights in Tucson, Arizona. And our marvelous coach, such a gentleman. His boys, such gentlemen. But there was a boy on the team who got a concussion, and he went out to play football that night. And the evenings in September in Tucson are nice and cool. The days are hot. So it wasn't that it was too hot or anything like that. It was a nice time to be outdoors playing football. But his head injury was worse than they thought. And being soft tissue damage didn't exactly show up on the x-ray that he'd gotten. So he went out and he played. And it turned out he had a subdural hematoma. So under the dermal layer of skin, he had a swelling next to his brain. And it killed him. And I think that was like my second month of high school. So the thing that correlates to this book and why I bring it up is it was hours hours and hours later when he died, and he was absolutely fine until he just wasn't. So it totally doesn't surprise me that Leonard's hit his head. He fell from 3 or 4 feet up, and that if you fall and land on your head, that's not going to be good for you or anyone who cares about you. And it wasn't until hours later that he actually died and was walking around and talking and, trying to convince people that this had happened, and they were having none of it because he was a horrible person. The kid who played football at my school was not a horrible person, though, so that was very sad. And we're working backwards from the end of the chapters today. What did you think about Margaret at the train station? Going in, buying the ticket, these men are watching her, she's all proud. And I guess I thought that the guy who was kind of staring at her, that she interpreted as him thinking she was hot, was actually Leonard's eyeballing Frederick and her. I wondered if she would have recognized him even down in Halston. I don't know. You never really get a sense of whether she would have or not. Dixon certainly did. But then she's the one who picks up Frederick's bag and runs with it. Run, Frederick, run, get in the train. The door opens, she helps him get in, she hands him the bag, and she's running in her shoes and a corset and probably a hat. Wow, what a woman. And then, she's kind of overcome, probably at least in part because of the corset, and goes and sits in the ladies' waiting room. And I thought, for the first time, having segregated space where the men weren't going to follow you, really paid off. Wow, she needed that. And I love that instead of going and trying to hail a cab or anything like that, she's like, no, public transportation. I'm taking the train back. It's more lit. There are other people around. There's lots of other people around. Nobody can overtake you the way that they could on a horse if you were in a cab. She's a smart cookie. And I think I would love to be a fly on the wall and see how a Victorian woman would have responded to that chapter, and especially how a Victorian man would have responded to that chapter. I wish I could go back in time and see that. I would be fascinated to know. I've read some reviews of the book, but they don't often zero in on particular moments. They did some with Jane Eyre, which was interesting, but I haven't seen that so much with this one. I'm still reading, more stuff, so maybe I'll come across something that I can share with you. And that is where we will end it for this week. And that's it. Have a great week. I will talk to you next week. Take care of yourself. Have a good one. Bye. 353, Chapter 35. Book Talk begins at...
Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania.
Episode 353, Strange Fire. Well, hello. The first thing I want to bring to your attention is, if you are listening to this podcast, you will notice, I hope it shows, that there is a phone number at the top of the show notes. Tap that phone number, and your phone will call the CraftLit listener line. It can record, I think, up to 4 minutes of quality audio, depending on how good your phone connection is. And that audio will immediately be sent to me as an audio file so that I can play it on the next episode. And you can really and truly participate in the conversation in an easier way than having to get to a computer and write out an email or try and tap out a huge email on your phone or tablet, which can be tiresome. So that was very exciting. I am very excited about it anyway. I hope you are as well. And to show you just how good the audio sounds, I have a sample that I received in my mailbox today.
Hello. I just wanted to say how much I love CraftLit. Heather, you are like my very favorite teacher from high school who made me love reading in the first place. Your comments and background add richness and thoughtfulness to the books I never would have known about, and you really help us get all the inside jokes. You make me love books that I never would have appreciated before CraftLit, and thank you for that.
Which just made my day. But you don't have to call and say lovely things like that. You can call and say, hey, I have this idea about the book, or why did you say that about the book? Or, I thought this about the book. And I can play those kinds of comments too. And then there's the name of this podcast. Strange Fire is this episode. I'll tell you, it was one of those weird moments where there's a confluence of events that just makes sense. So I was thinking about the craftiness, and then when I got that email from Urena, I thought, that's another kind of craftiness. I mean, shooting lasers, it sounds like alchemy, right? Shooting lasers into material to turn it into something else, that is just so cool and transformative and exciting. And it's also mathy and sciencey, which is great, but it's totally crafty. And then I also had this experience during the week of the car. This poor car. Our car is not young. It is a 12-year-old Saturn Vue SUV. It gets ridiculously good mileage. We get like 30 miles to the gallon on the highway. It's a great car. It is no longer being made because it's a Saturn, which means parts are no longer being made, which means stuff has to get jury-rigged sometimes. We had a thing with the bushings on the back axle joint where everything gets connected up together, and the bushings were shot, and something with the axle was shot too, and there were no parts. This is back when we were in Virginia. We had to go to a junkyard in Idaho, and for those of you who don't live in the United States, Virginia is on the East Coast, and Idaho is towards the Pacific Northwest. It's up in the north, and it's right up there next to Washington, in between Washington and Montana. So just to get a part. So I started hearing this noise, and I could start to feel it through the gas pedal and the brake pedal and the clutch. It was making me very nervous because it wasn't tied to the engine. And eventually, by Tuesday, it sounded like I was driving a prop plane. So you have to imagine, you can hear the sound of the engine. You can hear it shift, you can hear all that. But underneath it all, you can hear this increasingly loud prop plane, that kind of drone. I know, it's like being on Car Talk, right? So finding a shop that could look at the noise after I dropped the boys off, that was drama. But I found this guy who was my grandfather. He's a one-stall car repair guy. He's called the Car Doctor here in New Hope. And he's been there for 21 years. He's been in the country for 23 years. He had the oddest accent, and I couldn't place it. And it's because he was born in France, in Paris, to French parents who, when he was a very small child, moved to Holland. So he grew up in Amsterdam with French-speaking parents. So he has this really interesting blend of Parisian French and Dutch. His English, of course, is excellent. Every Dutchman I know who speaks English, you can barely hear an accent at all, which is why it was so hard to place him. Nicest guy in the world. Totally helped me out in a pinch. He told me he had to finish something, and then he'd put my car up on the lift, and he'd take a look and he'd see what it was. And it was interesting because at first, when we started talking, I think he expected that, like a lot of women, unfortunately, I had a very vague idea of what was going on. But the longer we talked, the more I was able to give him detailed information. Like, I first noticed it on the highway, so I thought it was because I had radial tires and that they were driving on a grooved interstate or a grooved highway, and that was that noise. And his eyes perked up and he nodded. And I said, but then I was driving on a country road and I heard the same sound, so now I know it's not that. And so he started nodding and really paying attention. And together, just talking and asking questions, we eliminated a lot of possibilities. And it was one of those problem-solving things of, I'm in a room that has nothing but joists and paper-backed insulation on the ceiling. How can I cover that without screw gunning really lame paneling or drywall to the ceiling, which I don't want to do and which is expensive? Oh, I know. I can cover everything in white sheets and create a lighter room and an airier room and still a quiet room, which is great for podcasting. And so, it's all crafty problem solving. He told me to go and get a Coke at the diner next door and come back in an hour. So I did. I got some work done and I came back and my car's up on the lift and he said, "It's your bearings." And I said, "So is there a way to inject more grease into the bearings?" Because I remember my grandfather having a pot of grease in his garage, and his garage looked exactly like this guy's fix-it shop. There's stuff it's 21 years of car parts and equipment and tools. It was awesome. So it turns out, ladies, this is good for you to know, that the bearings are a one-piece piece. It's an inner collar that goes on the axle, and then you have your bearings and your grease all inside that with this outer part, which is the part that attaches to your wheel. This is the thing that lets it spin. This is the Lego piece that you have to put the rubber tire on in order to have a turning wheel on a Lego car. So it's kind of an important piece, right? And they're made as a single sealed item so that you never have to lube it, you never have to deal with it until the grease just over time decays. Well, what happens then, the question is, if the grease goes away after 12 years? That would be that the metal, because of the friction, the metal will heat up enough to seize up, melt itself against itself, these two parts, and it will, for all intents and purposes, weld itself to itself. And then your wheel stops turning while you're driving, probably fast because friction and heat. So I looked at him and said, "So I need to do this now." And he said, "You need to do this now." So there we are. So I got to stand there and watch him work. I didn't want to go back to the diner. Their air conditioning was lousy anyway, hotter than blazes, but I'm standing in the shade. There's a breeze if you're standing out in front. And I got to watch him. Okay, this piece has been on that car for 12 years. So all the water and the dust and the driving and the friction and everything had pretty much gunk welded this piece onto the axle. This man had to take a metal sledgehammer, a small one, not one of the big ones like you drive iron spikes through the railroads with, and beat the bejuju's out of that thing. It wouldn't budge. He had to get out the acetylene torch and light up the metal, heating up the metal on this piece around the axle to get it to soften enough to pound it off. It was amazing to watch this guy problem solve. And now, book. So you may recall the end of the last chapter was important. Mr. Thornton had come over to visit Mr. Hale. He, this time, actually did look at Margaret and saw how overcome with grief she was, and sat and talked to Mr. Hale with her in the room until Dixon came and announced that someone was there to see Margaret. And that was the detective, the police officer, who let her know that Leonard's had died. She left that meeting, went up to the study, and fell down dead swoon. She probably clonked herself pretty well on the head when she fell. So she has knocked herself out. And that's where we pick up with the story. Those two scenes, Thornton and Hale talking, and Margaret completely passed out. We already talked a little bit about Margaret's strange fire early on in this chapter. And the last week's set of chapters felt to me like a pretty big turning point. But that strange fire moment in this chapter seems like it kind of finishes the turn for Margaret. I don't think she recognizes it necessarily, but I think it's becoming clearer to us. Well, she starts to recognize something at the end of this chapter. And that is one of the things that makes this such an interesting listen, because Margaret will start the chapter with a very decided, determined attitude in one direction. And then due to things that happen during the chapter, by the end, she has absolutely turned on a dime and everything is different for her, which is always interesting and fun to watch, but can also be a little melodramatic sometimes. So there's a bit of hand-wringing in this episode and a bit of back of the hand to the forehead moments. But there's also very much some teenage boy moments from Mr. Thornton. And at first I kind of thought, oh, he'd never think like that. He'd never behave like that. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. How much practice does he have with falling for someone? If we go through our teenage years and our early 20s actively dating people, more than one person, then by the time you've gotten to Mr. Thornton's age, you're kind of inured to some of the more dramatic mood swings that accompany a first infatuation or a first love. But I don't think Mr. Thornton has had that happen before. So a lot of his emotions, while they seem to me at my ripe old age to be very young and almost silly, I think Gaskell's probably closer to the truth of how a man like him, especially a man like him who's been working so hard and sacrificing so much to get ahead, might respond to falling in love with someone who doesn't love him back. And then there's a statement later in the chapter about finding a packet on the point of sailing. And that's just a ship that's about to leave. And it will make more sense now when you hear that. There are two instances of foreign language quotations in this chapter. The first comes from Dante's La Vita Nuova, and the translation is, "A soothing spirit that is full of love, saying forever to the soul, oh, sigh." Which I say a lot. Sigh, when things just keep going the way you really did not want them to go. Sigh. There was a show at UCLA the first year I was there called Feast of Youth, and it was the story of when F. Scott Fitzgerald met Zelda Sayer. And Julie Pickering played Zelda Sayer. Wow, I am pulling this out of nowhere. And one of her lines, every so often when the men were, flirting with Zelda or trying to get her to go out with him, she'd be standing there listening politely, and then she'd just say, yawn. And I always thought, I have never had the guts to do that, but gosh, that would have been fun to be that person who could do that. I could have saved a lot of time. But the other quotation in question comes a little bit later in the chapter. We have heard this quotation before. It's French. We heard it back in chapter 25, volume 125. And the translation for the French is, "Do what you should do, come what may." And now, that makes some sense, owing to what Margaret has been through in the previous couple of chapters. Oh, and the last bit. Dolores is based on the word dolor, which is sadness, or to be sad. So you could make puns about the name of Frederick's love down in Spain. So, as far as I'm going. And I think it's time to play you the chapter. And I'll catch you on the flip side. We'll have a little chat. Here you go, chapter 35, or volume 2, chapter 10 of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell.
Chapter 35. Expiation. There's naught so finely spun, but it cometh to the sun. Mr. Thornton sat on and on. He felt that his company gave pleasure to Mr. Hale, and was touched by the half-spoken wishful entreaty that he would remain a little longer, the plaintive, "Don't go yet," which his poor friend put forth from time to time. He wondered Margaret did not return, but it was with no view of seeing her that he lingered. For the hour, and in the presence of one who was so thoroughly feeling the nothingness of earth, he was reasonable and self-controlled. He was deeply interested in all her father said, of death and of the heavy lull, and of the brain that has grown dull. It was curious how the presence of Mr. Thornton had power over Mr. Hale to make him unlock the secret thoughts which he kept shut up even from Margaret. Whether it was that her sympathy would be so keen and show itself in so lively a manner that he was afraid of the reaction upon himself, or whether it was that to his speculative mind all kinds of doubts presented themselves at such a time, pleading and crying aloud to be resolved into certainties, and that he knew she would have shrunk from the expression of any such doubts, nay, from him himself as capable of conceiving them. Whatever was the reason, he could unburden himself better to Mr. Thornton than to her of all the thoughts and fancies and fears that had been frost-bound in his brain till now. Mr. Thornton said very little, but every sentence he uttered added to Mr. Hale's reliance and regard for him. Was it that he paused in the expression of some remembered agony? Mr. Thornton's 2 or 3 words would complete the sentence, and show how deeply its meaning was entered into. Was it a doubt, a fear, a wandering uncertainty seeking rest, but finding none, so tear-blinded were its eyes? Mr. Thornton, instead of being shocked, seemed to have passed through that very stage of thought himself, and could suggest where the exact ray of light was to be found which should make the dark places plain. Man of action as he was, busy in the world's great battle, there was a deeper religion binding him to God in his heart, in spite of his strong willfulness, through all his mistakes, than Mr. Hale had ever dreamed. They never spoke of such things again, as it happened, but this one conversation made them peculiar people to each other, knit them together in a way which no loose, indiscriminate talking about sacred things can ever accomplish. When all are admitted, how can there be a holy of holies? And all this while, Margaret lay as still and white as death on the study floor. She had sunk under her burden. It had been heavy in weight and long carried, and she had been very meek and patient, till all at once her faith had given way, and she had groped in vain for help. There was a pitiful contraction of suffering upon her beautiful brows, although there was no other sign of consciousness remaining. The mouth, a little while ago so sullenly projected in defiance, was relaxed and livid. The first symptom of returning life was a quivering about the lips, a little mute, soundless attempt at speech, but the eyes were still closed, and the quivering sank into stillness. Then, feebly leaning on her arms for an instant to steady herself, Margaret gathered herself up and rose. Her comb had fallen out of her hair, and with an intuitive desire to efface the traces of weakness and bring herself into order again, she sought for it, although from time to time, in the course of the search, she had to sit down and recover strength. Her head drooped forwards, her hands meekly laid one upon the other. She tried to recall the force of her temptation by endeavoring to remember the details which had thrown her into such deadly fright, but she could not. She only understood 2 facts: that Frederick had been in danger of being pursued and detected in London as not only guilty of manslaughter, but as the more unpardonable leader of the mutiny, and that she had lied to save him. There was one comfort. Her lie had saved him, if only by gaining some additional time. If the inspector came again tomorrow, after she had received the letter she longed for to assure her of her brother's safety, she would brave shame and stand in her bitter penance. She, the lofty Margaret, acknowledging before a crowded justice room, if need were, that she had been as a dog and done this thing. But if he came before she heard from Frederick, if he returned, as he had half threatened, in a few hours, why, she would tell that lie again. Though how the words would come out after all this terrible pause for reflection and self-reproach, without betraying her falsehood, she did not know. She could not tell. But her repetition of it would gain time for Frederick. She was roused by Dixon's entrance into the room. She had just been letting out Mr. Thornton. He had hardly gone 10 steps in the street before a passing omnibus stopped close by him, and a man got down and came up to him, touching his hat as he did so. It was the police inspector. Mr. Thornton had obtained for him his first situation in the police, and had heard from time to time of the progress of his protégé, but they had not often met, and at first Mr. Thornton did not remember him. "My name is Watson, George Watson, sir, that you got." "Ah, yes, I recollect. Why, you are getting on famously, I hear." "Yes, sir. I ought to thank you, sir, but it is on a little matter of business I made so bold as to speak to you now. I believe you were the magistrate who attended to take down the deposition of a poor man who died in the infirmary last night." "Yes," replied Mr. Thornton. "I went and heard some kind of a rambling statement, which the clerk said was of no great use. I'm afraid he was but a drunken fella, though there is no doubt he came to his death by violence at last. One of my mother's servants was engaged to him, I believe, and she is in great distress today. What about him?" "Why, sir, his death is oddly mixed up with somebody in the house I saw you coming out of just now. It was a Mr. Ailes, I believe." "Yes," said Mr. Thornton, turning sharp round and looking into the inspector's face with sudden interest. "What about it?" "Why, sir, it seems to me that I've got a pretty distinct chain of evidence inculpating a gentleman who was walking with Miss Ailes that night at the Outwood station as the man who struck or pushed Leonards off the platform and so caused his death. But the young lady denies that she was there at the time." "Miss Ailes denies she was there?" repeated Mr. Thornton in an altered voice. "Tell me, what evening was it? What time?" "About 6 o'clock on the evening of Thursday the 26th. They walked on, side by side, in silence for a minute or two. The inspector was the first to speak. "You see, sir, there is like to be a coroner's inquest, and I've got a young man who is pretty positive, at least it was at first. Since he has heard of the young lady's denial, he says he should not like to swear, but still is pretty positive that he saw Miss Ailes at the station, walking about with a gentleman, not 5 minutes before the time when one of the porters saw a scuffle, which he set down to some of Leonard's impudence, but which led to the fall which caused his death. And seeing you come out of the very house, sir, I thought I might make bold to ask if, you see, it's always awkward having to do with cases of disputed identity, and one doesn't like to doubt the word of a respectable young woman unless one has strong proof to the contrary." "And she denied having been at the station that evening," repeated Mr. Thornton in a low, brooding tone. "Yes, sir, twice over, as distinct as could be. I told her I should call again, but seeing you just as I was on my way back from questioning the young man who said it was her, I thought I would ask your advice, both as the magistrate who saw Leonards on his deathbed, and as the gentleman who got me my berth in the force." "You were quite right," said Mr. Thornton. "Don't take any steps till you have seen me again." "The young lady will expect me to call from what I said." "I only want to delay you an hour. It's no 3. Come to my warehouse at 4. "Very well, sir." And they parted company. Mr. Thornton hurried to his warehouse, and, sternly forbidding his clerks to allow anyone to interrupt him, he went his way to his own private room and locked the door. Then he indulged himself in the torture of thinking it all over and realizing every detail. How could he have lulled himself into the unsuspicious calm in which her tearful image had mirrored itself not 2 hours before, till he had weakly pitied her and yearned towards her, and forgotten the savage, distrustful jealousy with which the sight of her, and that unknown to him, at such an hour, in such a place, had inspired him? How could one so pure have stooped from her decorous and noble manner of bearing? But was it decorous? Was it? He hated himself for the idea that forced itself upon him, just for an instant, no more, and yet, while it was present, thrilled him with its odd potency of attraction towards her image. And then this falsehood, how terrible must be some dread of shame to be revealed, for, after all, the provocation given by such a man as Leonard's was, when excited by drinking, might in all probability be more than enough to justify anyone who came forward to state the circumstances openly and without reserve. How creeping and deadly that fear which could bow down the truthful Margaret to falsehood. He could almost pity her. What would be the end of it? She could not have considered all she was entering upon. If there was an inquest and the young man came forward. Suddenly he started up. There should be no inquest. He would save Margaret. He would take the responsibility of preventing the inquest, the issue of which, from the uncertainty of the medical testimony, which he had vaguely heard the night before from the surgeon in attendance, could be but doubtful. The doctors had discovered an internal disease far advanced and sure to prove fatal. They had stated that death might have been accelerated by the fall or by the subsequent drinking and exposure to cold. If he had but known how Margaret would have become involved in the affair, if he had but foreseen that she would have stained her whiteness by a falsehood, he could have saved her by a word. For the question of inquest or no inquest had hung trembling in the balance only the night before. Miss Hale might love another, was indifferent and contemptuous to him, but he would yet do her faithful acts of service of which she should never know. He might despise her, but the woman whom he had once loved should be kept from shame, and shame it would be to pledge herself to a lie in a public court, or otherwise to stand and acknowledge her reason for desiring darkness rather than light. Very grey and stern did Mr. Thornton look as he passed out through his wondering clerks. He was away about half an hour, and scarcely less stern did he look when he returned, although his errand had been successful. He wrote 2 lines on a slip of paper, put it in an envelope, and sealed it up. Then he gave it to one of the clerks, saying, "I appointed Watson. He was a packer in the warehouse and who went into the police to call on me at 4 o'clock. I've just met with a gentleman from Liverpool who wishes to see me before he leaves town. Take care to give this note to Watson, he calls." The note contained these words: "There will be no inquest. Medical evidence not sufficient to justify it. Take no further steps. I've not seen the coroner, but I will take the responsibility." Well, thought Watson, it relieves me from an awkward job. None of my witnesses seemed certain of anything except the young woman. She was clear and distinct enough. The porter at the railroad had seen a scuffle, or when he found it was likely to bring him in as a witness, then it might not have been a scuffle, only a little larking, and Leonards might have jumped off the platform himself. He would not stick firm to anything. And Jennings, the grocer's shopman, well, he was not quite so bad, but I doubt if I could have got him up to an oath after he heard that Miss Hale flatly denied it. It would have been a troublesome job and no satisfaction. And now I must go and tell them they won't be wanted. He accordingly presented himself again at Mr. Hale's that evening. Her father and Dixon would fain have persuaded Margaret to go to bed, but they, neither of them, knew the reason for her low, continued refusals to do so. Dixon had learnt part of the truth, but only part. Margaret would not tell any human being of what she had said, and she did not reveal the fatal termination to Leonard's fall from the platform. So Dixon's curiosity combined with her allegiance to urge Margaret to go to rest, which her appearance, as she lay on the sofa, showed but too clearly that she required. She did not speak except when spoken to. She tried to smile back and reply to her father's anxious looks and words of tender enquiry, but instead of a smile, the wan lips resolved themselves into a sigh. He was so miserably uneasy that, at last, she consented to go into her own room and prepare for going to bed. She was indeed inclined to give up the idea that the inspector would call again that night, as it was already past 9 o'clock. She stood by her father, holding on to the back of his chair. "You will go to bed soon, Papa, won't you? Don't sit up alone." What his answer was she did not hear. The words were lost in the far smaller point of sound that magnified itself to her fears and filled her brain. There was a low ring at the doorbell. She kissed her father and glided downstairs with a rapidity of motion of which no one would have thought her capable who had seen her the minute before. She put aside Dixon. "Don't come. I will open the door. I know it is him. I must manage it all myself."
"As you please, miss,"
said Dixon testily, but in a moment afterwards she added,
"but you're not fit for it. You are more dead than alive."
"Am I?" said Margaret, turning round and showing her eyes all aglow with strange fire, her cheeks flushed, though her lips were baked and livid still. She opened the door to the inspector and preceded him into the study. She placed the candle on the table and snuffed it carefully before she turned round and faced him. "You are late," said she. "Well?" She held her breath for the answer. "I'm sorry to have given any unnecessary trouble, ma'am, for, after all, they've given up all thoughts of holding an inquest. I've had other work to do and other people to see, or I should have been here before now." "Then it is ended," said Margaret. "There is to be no further enquiry." "I believe I've got Mr. Thornton's note about me," said the inspector, fumbling in his pocket-book. "Mr. Thornton's?" said Margaret. "Yes, he's a magistrate. Here it is." She could not see to read it. No, not although she was close to the candle. The words swam before her. But she held it in her hand and looked at it as if she were intently studying it. "I'm sure, ma'am, it's a great weight off my mind, for the evidence was so uncertain, you see, that the man had received any blow at all, and if any question of identity came in, it so complicated the case as I told Mr. Thornton." "Mr. Thornton?" said Margaret again. "I met him this morning just as he was coming out of this house, and as he's an old friend of mine, besides being the magistrate who saw Leonard's last night, I made bold to tell him of my difficulty." Margaret sighed deeply. She did not want to hear any more. She was afraid alike of what she had heard and of what she might hear. She wished that the man would go. She forced herself to speak. "Thank you for calling. It is very late. I dare say it is past 10 o'clock. Oh, here is the note," she continued, suddenly interpreting the meaning of the hand held out to receive it. He was putting it up when she said, "I think it is a cramped, dazzling sort of writing. I could not read it. Will you just read it to me?" He read it aloud to her. "Thank you. You told Mr. Thornton that I was not there." "Oh, of course, ma'am. I'm sorry now that I acted upon information which seems to have been so erroneous. At first the young man was so positive, and now he says that he doubted all along, and hopes that his mistake won't have occasioned you such annoyance as to lose their shop your custom. Good night, ma'am." "Good night." She rang the bell for Dixon to show him out. As Dixon returned up the passage, Margaret passed her swiftly. "It is all right," said she, without looking at Dixon. and before the woman could follow her with further questions, she had sped upstairs and entered her bedchamber and bolted her door. She threw herself, dressed as she was, upon her bed. She was too much exhausted to think. Half an hour or more elapsed before the cramped nature of her position and the chilliness, supervening upon great fatigue, had the power to rouse her numbed faculties. Then she began to recall, to combine, to wonder. The first idea that presented itself to her was that all this sickening alarm on Frederick's behalf was over, that the strain was past. The next was a wish to remember every word of the inspector's which related to Mr. Thornton. When had he seen him? What had he said? What had Mr. Thornton done? What were the exact words of his note? And until she could recollect, even to the placing or omitting an article, the very expressions which he had used in the note, her mind refused to go on with its progress. But the next conviction she came to was clear enough. Mr. Thornton had seen her close to Outwood Station on the fatal Thursday night, and had been told of her denial that she was there. She stood as a liar in his eyes. She was a liar, but she had no thought of penitence before God. Nothing but chaos and night surrounded the one lurid fact that, in Mr. Thornton's eyes, she was degraded. She cared not to think, even to herself, of how much of excuse she might plead. That had nothing to do with Mr. Thornton. She never dreamed that he or anyone else could find cause for suspicion in what was so natural as her accompanying her brother. But what was really false and wrong was known to him, and he had a right to judge her. "Oh, Frederick, Frederick," she cried, "what have I not sacrificed for you?" Even when she fell asleep, her thoughts were compelled to travel the same circle, only with exaggerated and monstrous circumstances of pain. When she awoke, a new idea flashed upon her with all the brightness of the morning. Mr. Thornton had learnt her falsehood before he went to the coroner. That suggested the thought that he had possibly been influenced so to do with a view of sparing her the repetition of her denial. But she pushed this notion on one side with the sick willfulness of a child. If it were so, she felt no gratitude to him, as it only showed her how keenly he must have seen that she was disgraced already before he took such unwanted pains to spare her any further trial of truthfulness which had already failed so signally. She would have gone through the whole. She would have perjured herself to save Frederick far rather than Mr. Thornton should have had the knowledge that prompted him to interfere to save her. What ill fate brought him in contact with the inspector? What made him be the very magistrate sent for to receive Leonard's deposition? What had Leonard said? How much of it was intelligible to Mr. Thornton, who might already, for aught she knew, be aware of the old accusation against Frederick through their mutual friend, Mr. Bell? If so, he had striven to save the son who came in defiance of the law to attend his mother's deathbed. And, under this idea, she could feel grateful. Not yet, if ever she could, if his interference had been prompted by contempt. Oh, had anyone such just cause to feel contempt for her? Mr. Thornton, above all people, on whom she had looked down from her imaginary heights till now. She suddenly found herself at his feet and was strangely distressed at her fall. She shrank from following out the premises to their conclusion, and so acknowledging to herself how much she valued his respect and good opinion. Whenever this idea presented itself to her at the end of a long avenue of thoughts, she turned away from following that path. She would not believe in it. It was later than she fancied, for in the agitation of the previous night she had forgotten to wind up her watch, and Mr. Hale had given especial orders that she was not to be disturbed by the usual awakening. By and by the door opened cautiously, and Dixon put her head in. Perceiving that Margaret was awake, she came forwards with a letter.
"Here's something to do you good, miss. A letter from Master Frederick."
"Thank you, Dixon. How late it is." She spoke very languidly, and suffered Dixon to lay it on the counterpane before her, without putting out a hand to take it.
You want your breakfast, I'm sure. I'll bring it to you in a minute. Master's got the tray all ready, I know.
Margaret did not reply. She let her go. She felt that she must be alone before she could open that letter. She opened it at last. The first thing that caught her eye was the date 2 days earlier than she received it. He had then written when he had promised, and their alarm might have been spared. But she would read the letter and see. It was hasty enough, but perfectly satisfactory. He had seen Henry Lennox, who knew enough of the case to shake his head over it in the first instance, and tell him he had done a very daring thing in returning to England with such an accusation, backed by such powerful influence hanging over him. But when they had come to talk it over, Mr. Lennox had acknowledged that there might be some chance of his acquittal if he could but prove his statements by credible witnesses, that in such case it might be worth while to stand his trial. Otherwise, it would be a great risk. He would examine, he would take every pains. "It struck me," said Frederick, "that your introduction, little sister of mine, went a long way. Is it so? He made many inquiries, I can assure you. He seemed a sharp, intelligent fellow, and in good practice, too, to judge from the signs of business and the number of clerks about him. But these may be only lawyers' dodges. I have just caught a packet on the point of sailing. I am off in 5 minutes. I may have to come back to England again on this business, so keep my visit secret. I shall send my father some rare old sherry, such as you cannot buy in England, such stuff as I've got in the bottle before me. He needs something of the kind. My dear love to him. God bless him. I'm sure, here's my cab. P.S. What an escape that was. Take care you don't breathe of my having been, not even to the shores." Margaret turned to the envelope. It was marked, "Too late." The letter had probably been trusted to some careless waiter who had forgotten to post it. Oh, what slight cobwebs of chances stand between us and temptation! Frederick had been safe and out of England 20, nay, 30 hours ago. And it was only about 17 hours since she had told a falsehood to baffle pursuit, which even then would have been vain. How faithless she had been! Where now was her proud motto, "Fais ce que doit, advienne que pourra"? If she had but dared to bravely tell the truth as regarded herself, defying them to find out what she refused to tell concerning another, how light of heart she would now have felt. Not humbled before God, as having failed in trust towards him, not degraded and abased in Mr. Thornton's sight. She caught herself up at this with a miserable tremor. Here was she classing his low opinion of her alongside with the displeasure of God. How was it that he haunted her imagination so persistently? What could it be? Why did she care for what he thought, in spite of all her pride, in spite of herself? She believed that she could have borne the sense of almighty displeasure because he knew all and could read her penitence and hear her cries for help in time to come. But Mr. Thornton, why did she tremble and hide her face in the pillow? What strong feeling had overtaken her at last? She sprang out of bed and prayed long and earnestly. It soothed and comforted her so to open her heart. But as soon as she reviewed her position, she found the sting was still there, that she was not good enough nor pure enough to be indifferent to the lowered opinion of a fellow creature, that the thought of how he must be looking upon her with contempt stood between her and her sense of wrongdoing. She took her letter in to her father as soon as she was dressed. There was so slight an allusion to their alarm at the railroad station that Mr. Hale passed over it without paying any attention to it. Indeed, beyond the mere fact of Frederick having sailed undiscovered and unsuspected, he did not gather much from the letter at the time. He was so uneasy about Margaret's pallid looks. She seemed continually on the point of weeping. "You are sadly overdone, Margaret. It is no wonder. but you must let me nurse you now." He made her lie down on the sofa and went for a shawl to cover her with. His tenderness released her tears, and she cried bitterly. "Poor child, said he, looking fondly at her as she lay with her face to the wall, shaking with her sobs. After a while they ceased, and she began to wonder whether she durst give herself the relief of telling her father of all her trouble. But there were more reasons against it than for it. The only one for it was the relief to herself, and against it was the thought that it would add materially to her father's nervousness if it were indeed necessary for Frederick to come to England again. That he would dwell on the circumstance of his son's having caused the death of a man, however unwittingly and unwillingly, that this knowledge would perpetually recur to trouble him in various shapes of exaggeration and distortion from the simple truth. And about her own great fault he would be distressed beyond measure at her want of courage and faith, yet perpetually troubled to make excuses for her. Formerly Margaret would have come to him as priest as well as father, to tell him of her temptation and her sin, but latterly they had not spoken much on such subjects, and she knew not how, in his change of opinions, he would reply if the depth of her soul called unto his. No, she would keep her secret and bear the burden alone. Alone she would go before God and cry for his absolution. Alone she would endure her disgraced position in the opinion of Mr. Thornton. She was unspeakably touched by the tender efforts of her father to think of cheerful subjects on which to talk, and so to take her thoughts away from dwelling on all that had happened of late. It was some months since he had been so talkative as he was this day. He would not let her sit up, and offended Dixon desperately by insisting on waiting upon her himself. At last she smiled, a poor, weak little smile, but it gave him the truest pleasure. "It seems strange to think that what gives us most hope for the future should be called Dolores," said Margaret. The remark was more in character with her father than with her usual self, but today they seemed to have changed natures. "Her mother was a Spaniard, I believe. That accounts for her religion. Her father was a stiff Presbyterian when I knew him, but it is a very soft and pretty name." "How young she is, younger by 14 months than I am, just the age that Edith was when she was engaged to Captain Lennox. Papa, we will go and see them in Spain." He shook his head, but he said, "If you wish it, Margaret, only let us come back here. It would seem unfair, unkind to your mother, who always, I'm afraid, disliked Milton so much, if we left it now she is lying here and cannot go with us. No, dear, you shall go and see them and bring me back a report of my Spanish daughter." "No, Papa, I won't go without you. Who is to take care of you when I'm gone?" "I should like to know which of us is taking care of the other. But if you went, I should persuade Mr. Thornton to let me give him double lessons. We would work up the classics famously. That would be a perpetual interest. You might go on and see Edith at Corfu if you liked." Margaret did not speak all at once. Then she said, rather gravely, "Thank you, Papa, but I don't want to go. We will hope that Mr. Lennox will manage so well that Frederick may bring Dolores to see us when they are married. And as for Edith, the regiment won't remain much longer in Corfu. Perhaps we shall see both of them here before another year is out." Mr. Hale's cheerful subjects had come to an end. Some painful recollection had stolen across his mind and driven him into silence. By and by Margaret said, "Papa, did you see Nicholas Higgins at the funeral? He was there, and Mary too. Poor fellow, it was his way of showing sympathy. He has a good warm heart under his bluff, abrupt ways." "I am sure of it," replied Mr. Hale. "I saw it all along, even while you tried to persuade me that he was all sorts of bad things. We will go and see them tomorrow, if you are strong enough to walk so far." "Oh, yes, I want to see them. We did not pay Mary, or rather she refused to take it, Dixon says. We will go so as to catch him just after his dinner and before he goes to his work." Towards evening, Mr. Hale said, "I half expected Mr. Thornton would have called. He spoke of a book yesterday which he had and which I wanted to see. He said he would try and bring it today." Margaret sighed. She knew he would not come. He would be too delicate to run the chance of meeting her while her shame must be so fresh in his memory. The very mention of his name renewed her trouble and produced a relapse into the feeling of depressed, preoccupied exhaustion. She gave way to listless languor. Suddenly it struck her that this was a strange manner to show her patience, or to reward her father for his watchful care of her all through the day. She sat up and offered to read aloud. His eyes were failing, and he gladly accepted her proposal. She read well. She gave the due emphasis, but had anyone asked her when she had ended the meaning of what she had been reading, she could not have told. She was smitten with a feeling of ingratitude to Mr. Thornton, inasmuch as, in the morning, she had refused to accept the kindness he had shown her in making further inquiry from the medical men so as to obviate any inquest being held. Oh, she was grateful. She had been cowardly and false, and had shown her cowardliness and falsehood in action that could not be recalled. But she was not ungrateful. It sent a glow to her heart to know how she could feel towards one who had reason to despise her. His cause for contempt was so just that she should have respected him less if she had thought he did not feel contempt. It was a pleasure to feel how thoroughly she respected him. He could not prevent her doing that. It was the one comfort in all this misery. Late in the evening the expected book arrived, with Mr. Thornton's kind regards and wishes to know how Mr. Hale is. "Say that I am much better, Dixon, but that Miss Hale—" "No, Papa," said Margaret eagerly. "Don't say anything about me. He does not ask."
"My dear child, how you are shivering," said her father a few minutes afterwards. "You must go to bed directly. You have turned quite pale."
Margaret did not refuse to go, though she was loath to leave her father alone. She needed the relief of solitude after a day of busy thinking and busier repenting. But she seemed much as usual the next day. The lingering gravity and sadness and the occasional absence of mind were not unnatural symptoms in the early days of grief. And almost in proportion to her re-establishment in health was her father's relapse into his abstracted musing upon the wife he had lost and the past era in his life that was closed to him forever.
So Thornton has a reason to still love her because he can save her, which is a little gross, but also that tormented teenage boy, "You'll never know what I've done for you and how much I really love you." And it's sweet. It's sweet. I admit, I find it sweet. The rescuing thing, it is what it is. It's such a product of its time, right? And it still happens. I know. But Margaret's turnabout at the end, at the very, very end, I found interesting. Because it starts with her feeling bad for not being more grateful to her father for taking care of her. Finally. I know. And then that thought of being taken care of leads her to, oh my gosh, Mr. Thornton just took care of me as well, and in a big and serious way, saving her from public shame. Now, Thornton may have had the ulterior motive of wanting to save her from public shame because he still hopes that she's going to fall in love with him, and he doesn't want her to be ruined publicly if there's a chance of that happening. But for her, now that she knows that Frederick is safe, and realizes that she just got word too late. And by the way, that she turned the envelope over and sees that it said too late. That means it was too late for the mail. So it just sat there until the next mail pickup happened. And that was just long enough. But since she found out that Frederick was safe too late, she could have spared herself all of this. And she's trying to talk herself into believing that if she'd just been less cowardly or braver and just stood up to tell the truth, not even knowing whether Frederick was safe or not, that would have been better. But I think she's being too hard on herself in that instance, which isn't a surprise right now. But I think her recognition that Thornton has every reason to be really ticked off at her right now, because he has to know that she lied. And she knows he saw her with Frederick. And she knows he was upset about something when he saw her with Frederick. But I don't think she has completely put two and two together to think that Thornton is jealous of Frederick. Because to her, it would never occur to her that someone would see her with Frederick and think, oh, he's your beau, he's your boyfriend. But the lying thing, she knows Thornton knows. And she feels that one of the reasons she can respect him is because he must be holding her to this high moral standard and therefore have contempt for her because of her lying. And because of his contempt for her, she respects him more, because that shows excellent moral character, something that she very much respects. That's a conundrum wrapped around a pickle right there. And I love that she includes the thought he could not prevent her from doing that, from thoroughly respecting him. It was the one comfort in all this misery. He couldn't prevent her from respecting him, like he would. Like he'd prevent her from doing anything except putting herself up on charges of perjury by swearing false testimony at an inquest. Maybe he'd prevent her from doing that. And as I was thumbing back through my notes, I caught something just now. My book, which has the listing as Volume 1 and Volume 2 and all those chapter numbers that way, lists the title of this chapter as Explanation, which I thought was kind of odd. It's actually supposed to be Expiation. And that makes a lot more sense, because instead of explaining things in this chapter, expiation means the act of making amends or reparation for guilt or wrongdoing, atonement, especially towards a deity. Which makes a lot more sense for this chapter, doesn't it? And then the chapter ends with everything going back to normal. Her father goes back to his grief-stricken state. And she goes back to her own kind of vague, grief is such a weird thing. Days don't behave like days when you're in the middle of that. Time passes differently and strangely. And so at the end, even with all the excitement and all the hubbub, by the end of the chapter, we are reminded that this is just a family who is mourning the loss of a wife and a mother. And that is where Gaskell ends it, and that is where I will end it as well. 354, Chapter 36. Book Talk begins at... Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. I'm your host, Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 354, Labor's Fruits. Well, hello. Today's episode, titled Labor's Fruits, is not about the fruits of my labor, but the fruits of my kids' labor. Both of them have made it very clear that this is the first summer where they felt like their summer activities were matched perfectly to their personalities. Which makes you start to think, did your older son build some kind of large machine that has lasers on it? No, not yet. But he did make a robotic arm using hydraulics, which was really amazing. It was a wooden structure, And they used baby syringes and plastic tubing and water in order to open and close a robotic claw. And robotic in the sense that it is a non-human machine that moves, not necessarily of its own volition, but is powered, in this case by hydraulics, and can open and close and grasp something. And then the week before that, he did mock trial with an actual public defender, and they got a tour of the courthouse and the jail, and one of the kids got put into a cell, and he learned so much. It was great. And then this week, he is doing video production, which is filming and editing. And editing also means figuring out when and where to cut things, but also what music to add and stuff like that. So if he will let me embed his videos, you will be able to see those. If not, I think I can probably get away with linking to one of them as just a file. And so far, they're really good. I've seen 2 so far. He's working on the 3rd one today. And I'm so proud of him. He's worked so hard this summer. And next week, what is he? Next week is building an underwater rover. I have no idea what that means. I have 0 clue, but I'm very interested to see what it's going to look like when he brings it home, and hope it's not too big. And then thing 2, the younger boy. Oh my goodness. He was in his first big splashy musical. The town that we are in, or next to, New Hope, is a very theater oriented town. The Bucks County Playhouse is here. It's in a big mill. That's Milltown. And it is under new management since 2012. And so it's a marvelous space. Well, there's also a private school near here, the Solbury School. And the director of theater and music there runs a summer program for kids called Starcatchers. And Starcatchers does big splashy musicals with kids. So my son is among the younger, not the youngest, but among the younger batch of kids in this group. And they were doing The Little Mermaid Junior, which is very interesting, actually. If you know the Little Mermaid movie, the Disney version, it's very hard to imagine how you could possibly do that thing on stage. The climax of the movie being big fight scene underwater. They did some very clever things. Probably the most clever was the costumes. Just extraordinary, because how do you do mermaids? I mean, really, and a crab. And she did. This costumer from Cleveland, Wendy the costumer, came in, and they did a matinee, and they did an evening show, and she discovered that she really did need backup, and had heard from my son that I used to do theater. And so she came up to me after the matinee and said, could you help backstage with the costumes? Because the mom who worked on the matinee show wanted to see the show at nighttime. And I said, sure, absolutely. And I had so much fun getting these kids in and out of these amazing costumes. And my son was Prince Eric. When I worked at Disney, we used to call Prince generic. My son wasn't so generic. He was pretty good. And he was funny. And his part was actually kind of expanded from the movie, so it was even more fun. And he had to sing, and he had to dance, and he had to memorize his lines. And I've never seen this child work so hard, ever. But it's a marvelous program. And the girl who did Ariel, also a 10-year-old, like my son, she had to drive. No, let me correct that. Her parents had to drive her 2 hours to get here in the morning and 2 hours at night to get home. That was 3 weeks, 5 days a week of 2-hour commutes. Wow, commitment. And again, costuming wise, I posited the question earlier. How do you make a crab on stage? I'll tell you how you make a crab. You get one of those circular sleds. You know, the ones that are just a big plastic disc that have handles on them? You do that, and you cover it with red swimsuit material. You stipple around the thing and across the thing in patterns that are reminiscent of a crab's shell. You make arms, what are effectively arms, that are hanging off of it kind of the same way that the Cowardly Lion's tail hung off. I think she had some stiffening material inside. The Cowardly Lion tail was actually on a piece of fishing line, and that's why it would swing when he walked, because it was I think it was attached to the back on one string of fishing line, just to the back of his neck. And so as he moved, it would in fact kind of swing. And it was stuffed pretty solidly, so it held its shape and had that kind of nice curve of the tail at the end, because they didn't attach it to the very tip of the tail. They attached it 6 or 8 inches in. And then you put a red bowler hat on the kid, and you put little crab legs coming off of the hat as well. And you put googly eyes on sticks, or springs, they might have been springs, on top of his hat. It was genius. It was absolute genius. The whole thing was. And so my son had a lovely time and had the big, emotional letdown crash after the final curtain call. The kids all walked and got ice cream together and kind of tailed along after, trying to stay back far enough so that he could have his fun. And then when it was time to finally get in the car and go home, he just burst into tears. Because it's hard, you work so hard with this group of people, and then all of a sudden it's done, and you're done, and okay, bye. See you next summer. So that was interesting, but it was fantastic to see so far this summer the fruits of their labors being such big things for them, and things that they loved doing, and things that they've had to work hard at. And the really nice part was that here in New Hope, we could afford to have them go to these summer programs. And in Virginia, these kinds of summer programs would have been so far out of our reach. So I feel like we really did make the right decision coming up here, which is a nice settling feeling after being so kind of fraught for the last couple of months. And, I apologize if you can hear the birds. I cannot escape the birds. I feel like I'm in a Hitchcock film. I try and record before the birds start. And the short answer is, there is never time here when the birds are not singing. We also have frogs. We have a little pond out front. And I mean little. It's like maybe 5 feet across by 3 feet. It's little. It's right outside our bedroom window. And there are 3 frogs who live there. And a snake, a little tiny snake. And these frogs, they do not go ribbit, ribbit. I will try and record them some night this week. They don't always chirp every night. So someday I will get recordings of them. They have the weirdest sound. But I digress. The fauna here is loud, is what it comes down to. And the birds were particularly loud when I mentioned that, so I'm sorry. And book. Nobody called in on the phone line this week about the book, but I continue to have email conversations with some people who write in with questions or write in asking about things that they're wondering about, like, this book is so sad. And this week's chapter is going to be a sad one too. And what's the deal with that? I think it's certainly a part of Victorian literature in general. I think you see a big gap between the problems that Jane Austen's heroines faced in their stories, as opposed to the trials and tribulations that, say, Jane Eyre and Margaret Hale go through in their time. And I think a lot of it had to do with industrialization. The dichotomy, the split between the haves and the have-nots was really growing, which is not to say that there weren't haves and have-nots during Jane Austen's time. It was that the divide in the industrialized world was massive, because you have people and a government who are far more used to and comfortable with an agrarian life, or at least an agriculturally centered life and rhythm. And then you have the early adopters, the people who are all like Thornton and like Mrs. Thornton, interested and proud and jazzed about new technology. And the more that group grew and had success in those industries, the more you were going to start to see an economic split happening, because the people who were in industry could make money faster, and the people who were in agriculture had to go with the seasons. And there's nothing you can do about that except that it causes problems. And then on top of that, you take biases, belief systems, value systems from the agrarian world, where your farm laborers are probably not particularly well educated, may or may not be able to read or write, and you put that overlay over skilled manual labor. The people who were running these machines, I got to see one of these machines when we were on the London, Bath and Wales tour with Diane. These things were complicated. they could take your arm off, and they were big. And it was no joke. You had to be a pretty smart person to be able to work one of these things, and not just work it, but be able to tell if it was having trouble, be able to tell if it needed maintenance, be able to talk to your foreman about what was going on. And you had to be able to make your quota. And you had to work really hard hours, and you had to take on the responsibility for the fact that this was a dangerous operation and people could get hurt. And I think that's one of the reasons why Gaskell wrote Thornton the way she did. He worked his way up. He had a better chance of understanding. He has a better chance of understanding where his workers are coming from. And that's going to be really important. And in fact, today's chapter is called Union, Not Always Strength. And that's because the trade unions at the time were actively saying that union or unity was the only way that you could have any kind of strength when you were talking to or negotiating with a master, because most of them, not like Thornton, were incapable of hearing what you had to say. I mean, they understood, but they just thought the workers were whining and asking for more money because that's what they do. They're money grubbers instead of understanding that you're trying to raise a family and run a household and feed your kids and working long hours on dangerous machines. And maybe it was her Unitarianism, maybe it was the fact that she was a mother, but she did set out to write exactly this kind of book. You remember way back at the beginning of the book, we talked about how Elizabeth Gaskell was writing what's called a Condition of England book, which was particular to this time period. But her book is also a total Condition of England book. That means she's taking into account politics and economics and religion and gender, which means it's going to be a big, messy book. And it's kind of remarkable that she pulled it off at all. And I think part of the reason why she did pull it off was because she was writing it as a serial. And so the thing kind of had mission creep. It just kind of kept expanding. And this is supposed to be ultimately romantic literature. There is a love story at the heart of all of this. But I think Gaskell wanted the love story to mean something, so that it wasn't just Darcy and Elizabeth and really, really clever wordplay and lovely, nuanced symbolism. Instead, she's really going for an attempt to heal the country, I think. I think she was motivated by her religion. I think she was motivated by the fact that she was a mother and a woman. And I think that you really can start to see, especially in today's chapter, how desperately important she felt all of this was, and how much she's trying not to be didactic and lecture to people, but to really illustrate, look, this is what happens. This is the human cost of the problems that we are seeing. And there are solutions. And she's going to be able to take the last third of the book to take a look at some of the solutions that she had come up with. But I think they were also solutions that other people were coming up with. Her first book, Mary Barton, got pounded by the master class, and said it was, too much on the side of the hands. And so when she came to this book, she worked really hard to try and be more balanced and give both sides, or all sides, of the equation. And I think that that's part of why it feels so sad right now, is because there's that going on. There's the way it's reflected in our own time that's going on. I don't think this book would feel that sad in 1997 when the economy was booming and everybody had a job. But now when so many people are hurting and we're in wars and the landscape has changed so much, it's a little harder to read books that have trials in them, like what poor Margaret's going through. I mean, she's getting whacked over and over and over again, and today will be no different. But whether it's schadenfreude, the pleasure or satisfaction that one may get by watching others in pain or suffering, whether it's that or whether it's just that by comparison it makes our burdens feel a little bit lighter, books like this and Jane Eyre wind up being very popular for a very long time. I think it's good for the end of the book for us to go through all of this, because how much better is the end of Jane Eyre after having watched all the trouble that Rochester and Jane went through to get there? And we know Thornton and Margaret are going to wind up together, because that's the kind of book this is. But it's going to be hard. It's a hard-fought and hard-won journey. And in our journey today, you are going to need some words. This chapter really should have been titled Mappin', which is a contraction of may happen It's spelled M''APPEN. And you're going to hear mapping this and mapping that. It means probably something may happen, perhaps it'll happen, and that's all. But it's all over the place. Welly, the fire's welly out, means nearly. Would fain is I would do that gladly. I would do that with pleasure. Ought, AUGHT. You hear this all the time, and I decided to go look it up because it seemed to be getting used differently, and it turns out that that's because it gets used differently. It all depends on context. So it could mean everything, anything, or nothing. It's kind of like aloha. It just has a lot of meanings. So Higgins has a line when he says this guy went to promise aught. He went to promise everything and pledge himself to aught and pledge himself to anything. And when you hear it, you'll go, oh, okay, right. And it'll make more sense. Athens, A-THAT-ENDS means to that end or to those ends. You'll hear a reference to a Robert Burns poem, To a Mountain Daisy. And I have a very exciting CraftLit exclusive for you. Our own fabulous Scotsman, Arlen Donald, who has recorded for us, a couple times you've heard his fabulous brrr. He has recorded To a Mountain Daisy for us. But not only has he recorded it in the original, but he recorded an English translation because he had pity on all of us. So if you listen until the very, very, very end, you will be able to hear both. First the original, then the translation. And I have also embedded these into the show notes, which means they appear as a photo video on YouTube as well. So enjoy getting to hear what it's supposed to sound like. Ill read up means an unmade or an ashy fireplace. A fireplace where it hasn't been cleaned out and it isn't lit and it isn't fit to be lit yet. Butty, which Americans do not say. But when I was in the UK, I remember people referring to bread and butter as a snack in the afternoon as a buddy. And I think in this case, it actually means any kind of snackish substance, probably bread, maybe bread with something, butter or fat or meat or cheese or something like that. But that's all it is. And then I have a question. Vanessa asked me, and it was something that I had noticed too, and I just kept forgetting to say anything about, so this is why Vanessa is my brain. Up to London, down to Milton. I've heard this in Bleak House as well, and Vanessa and I are both baffled by this, because Milton would be to the north, which seems like up, and London would be to the south, which feels like down. I mean, that's so Northern Hemisphere centric, isn't it? But still, that's okay. That's where London is. Someone in the UK explain this? The only thing I could think of was, well, London's important, so you go up to the important city. But if you lived in Milton, you wouldn't say that London was more important than Milton. I don't know. Somebody tell us, please. Call in, let us know, set us right on this thorny problem. And then we're going to have some pretty important stuff to talk about on the flip side. So I now turn you over to chapter 36 of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell.
Chapter 36. Union Not Always Strength. The steps of the bearers, heavy and slow, the sobs of the mourners, deep and low. Shelley. At the time arranged the previous day, they set out on their walk to see Nicholas Higgins and his daughter. They both were reminded of their recent loss by a strange kind of shyness in their new habiliments and in the fact that it was the first time, for many weeks, that they had deliberately gone out together. They drew very close to each other in unspoken sympathy. Nicholas was sitting by the fireside in his accustomed corner, but he had not his accustomed pipe. He was leaning his head upon his hand, his arm resting on his knee. He did not get up when he saw them, though Margaret could read the welcome in his eye. "Sit ye down, fire's welly out," said he, giving it a vigorous poke, as if to turn attention away from himself. He was rather disorderly, to be sure, with a black, unshaven beard of several days' growth, making his pale face look yet paler, and a jacket which would have been all the better for patching. "We thought we should have a good chance of finding you just after dinner-time," said Margaret. "We have had our sorrow, too, since we saw you," said Mr. Hale. "Aye, aye. Sorrows is more plentiful than dinners just now, I reckon. My dinner hour stretches all over the day. You're pretty sure of finding me." "Are you out of work?" asked Margaret. "Aye," he replied shortly. Then, after a moment's silence, he added, looking up for the first time, "I'm not wanting brass. Dunno you think it. Bess, poor lass, had a little stock under her pillow, ready to slip into my hand last moment, and Mary is fustian cutting. But I'm out of work all the same." "We owe Mary some money," said Mr. Hale, before Margaret's sharp pressure on his arm could arrest the words. "If who takes it, I'll turn her out of doors. I'll bide inside these four walls, and she'll bide out, that's all." "But we owe her many thanks for her kind service," began Mr. Hale again. "I never thanked your daughter there for her deeds o' love to my poor wench. I ne'er could find the words. I'se have to begin and try now if you start making an ado about what little Mary could serve you." "Is it because of the strike you're out of work?" asked Margaret gently. "Strike's ended. It's o'er for this time. I'm out of work because I ne'er asked for it, and I never asked for it because good words is scarce, and bad words is plentiful." He was in a mood to take a surly pleasure in giving answers that were like riddles, but Margaret saw that he would like to be asked for the explanation. "And good words are—" "Asking for work. I reckon them's almost the best words that man can say. Give me work means, and I'll do it like a man. Them's good words." "And bad words are refusing you work when you ask for it?" "Aye. Bad words is saying, 'Aha, my fine chap, you've been true to your order, and I'll be true to mine. You did the best you could for them as wanted help. That's your way of being true to your kind, and I'll be true to mine. You've been a poor fool as knowed no better nor be a true faithful fool. So go and be damned to you. There's no work for you here.' Them's bad words. I'm not a fool, and if I was, folk ought to have taught me how to be wise after their fashion. I could m'appen ha' learnt, if anyone had tried to teach me." "Would it not be worthwhile," said Mr. Hale, "to ask your old master if he would take you back again? It might be a poor chance, but it would be a chance." He looked up again with a sharp glance at the questioner, and then tittered a low and bitter laugh. "Master, if it's no offence, I'll ask you a question or two in my turn." "You're quite welcome," said Mr. Hale. "I reckon you're some way of earning your bread. Folks seldom lives in Milton just for the pleasure they can live anywhere else." "You are quite right. I have some independent property, but my intention in settling in Milton was to become a private tutor." "To teach folk, well, I reckon they pay you for teaching them, dunnot they?" "Yes," replied Mr. Hale, smiling. "I teach in order to get paid." "And them that pays you, dun they tell you whatten to do or whatten not to do with the money they gives ye in just payment for your pains, in fair exchange like?" "No, to be sure not." "They dunnot say, 'You may have a brother or a friend, as dear as a brother, who wants this here brass for a purpose both you and he thinks right, but you mun promise not give it to him. You may see a good use, as you think, to put your money to, but we don't think it's good, and so, if you spend it a thatens, we'll just leave off dealing with you.' They dunnot say that, dun they?" "No, to be sure not." "Would you stand it if they did?" "It would be some very hard pressure that would make me even think of submitting to such dictation." "There's not the pressure on all the broad earth that would make me," said Nicholas Higgins. "Now you've got it. You've hit the bull's-eye. Ampers, That's where I worked. Makes their men pledge themselves they'll not give a penny to help the Union or keep turnouts from Clemen. They may pledge and make pledge, continued he scornfully. They nobbut make liars and hypocrites. And that's a less sin, to my mind, to making men's hearts so hard that they'll not do a kindness to them as needs it, or help on the right and just cause, though it goes again the strong hand. But I'll ne'er forswear myself for all the work the king could give me. I'm a member of the Union, and I think it's the only thing to do the workmen any good. And I've been a turnout, and known what it were to clem, so if I get a shilling, 6pence shall go to them if they axe it from me. Consequence is, I do not see where I'm to get a shilling.
Is that rule about not contributing to the Union in force at all the mills? Asked Margaret.
I cannot say. It's a new regulation at ourn, and I reckon they'll find that they cannot stick to it. But it's in force now. By and by they'll find out tyrants makes liars.
There was a little pause. Margaret was hesitating whether she should say what was in her mind. She was unwilling to irritate one who was already gloomy and despondent enough. At last out it came, but in her soft tones and with her reluctant manner, showing that she was unwilling to say anything unpleasant. It did not seem to annoy Higgins, only to perplex him. Do you remember poor Boucher saying that the Union was a tyrant? I think he said it was the worst tyrant of all. And I remember at the time I agreed with him. It was a long while before he spoke. He was resting his head on his 2 hands and looking down into the fire, so she could not read the expression on his face. I'll not deny but what the Union finds it necessary to force a man into his own good. I'll speak truth. A man leads a drear life who's not in the Union, but once in the Union, his interests are taken care on better nor he could do it for himself, or by himself for that matter. It's the only way working men can get their rights, by all joining together. More the members, more chance for each one separate man having justice done him. Government takes care of fools and madmen, and if any man is inclined to do himself or his neighbour a hurt, it puts a bit of check on him whether he likes it or no. That's all we do in the Union. We can't clap folk into prison, but we can make a man's life so heavy to be borne that he's obliged to come in and be wise and helpful in spite of himself. Boucher were a fool all along, and ne'er a worse fool than at the last. He did you harm? Asked Margaret.
Aye, that did he. We had public opinion on our side till he and his sort began rioting and breaking laws. It were all over with the strike then.
Then would it not have been far better to have left him alone and not forced him to join the Union? He did you no good, and you drove him mad.
Margaret,
said her father in a low and warning tone, for he saw the cloud gathering on Higgins' face.
I like her, said Higgins suddenly. Her speaks plain out what's in her mind. Her doesn't comprehend the Union for all that. It's a great power. It's our only power. I have read a bit of poetry about a plough going o'er a daisy, as made tears come into my eyes afore I'd other cause for crying. But the chap ne'er stopped driving the plough, I's warrant, for all he were pitiful about the daisy. He'd too much mother wit for that. The Union's the plough, making ready the land for harvest time. Such as Boucher, 'twould be setting him up too much to liken him to a daisy. He's like a weed lounging over the ground. Wouldn't just make up their mind to be put out of the way. I'm sore vexed with him just now, so mayhappen I do not speak him fair. I could go over him with a plough myself with all the pleasure in life.
Why, what has he been doing? Anything fresh?
Aye, to be sure, he's near out of mischief, that man. First of all, he must go raging like a mad fool and kick up yon riot. Then he'd go to hiding, where he'd been yet if Thornton had followed him out as I'd hoped he would have done.
But Thornton, having got his own purpose, didn't care to go on with the prosecution for the riot. So Boucher slunk back again to his house. He ne'er showed himself abroad for a day or two. He had that grace. And then, where think ye that he went? Why, to Hampers, damn him. He went with his mealy-mouthed face that turns me sick to look at, asking for work, though he knowed well enough the new rule, o' pledging themselves to give naught to the unions, naught to help the starving turn out. Why, he'd a clemmed to death if the union hadna helped him in his pinch. There he went, usen to promise aught, and pledge himself to aught, to tell all he'd knowed on our proceedings, the good-for-nothing Judas. But I'll say this for Hamper, and thank him for it at my dying day. He drove Boucher away, and wouldna listen to him, ne'er a word, though folk standing by says the traitor cried like a babby.
"Oh, how shocking! How pitiful!" exclaimed Margaret. "Higgins, I don't know you today. Don't you see how you've made Boucher what he is by driving him into the union against his will, without his heart going with it? You have made him what he is."
Made him what he is. What was he?
Gathering along the narrow street came a hollow, measured sound, now forcing itself on their attention. Many voices were hushed and low. Many steps were heard not moving onwards, at least not with any rapidity or steadiness of motion, but as if circling round one spot. Yes, there was one distinct slow tramp of feet, which made itself a clear path through the air and reached their ears. The measured, laboured walk of men carrying a heavy burden. They were all drawn towards the house door by some irresistible impulse, impelled thither not by a poor curiosity, but as if by some solemn blast. 6 men walked in the middle of the road, 3 of them being policemen. They carried a door taken off its hinges upon their shoulders, on which lay some dead human creature, and from each side of the door there were constant droppings. All the street turned out to see, and seeing, to accompany the procession, each one questioning the bearers, who answered almost reluctantly at last, so often had they told the tale.
"We found him in the brook in the field beyond there."
"The brook? Why, there's not water enough to drown him."
"He was a determined chap. He lay with his face downwards. He was sick enough for living, choose what cause he had for it."
Higgins crept up to Margaret's side and said in a weak, piping kind of voice,
"It's not John Boucher. He hadna spunk enough. Sure it's not John Boucher. Why, they are looking this way. Listen, I've a singing in my head, and I cannot hear." They put the door down carefully upon the stones, and all might see the poor drowned wretch, his glassy eyes, one half open, staring right upwards to the sky. Owing to the position in which he had been found lying, his face was swollen and discoloured besides. His skin was stained by the water in the brook, which had been used for dyeing purposes. The fore part of his head was bald, but the hair grew thin and long behind, and every separate lock was a conduit for water. Through all these disfigurements, Margaret recognized John Boucher. It seemed to her so sacrilegious to be peering into that poor, distorted, agonized face that, by a flash of instinct, she went forwards and softly covered the dead man's countenance with her handkerchief. The eyes that saw her do this followed her as she turned away from her pious office, and were thus led to the place where Nicholas Higgins stood, like one rooted to the spot. The men spoke together, and then one of them came up to Higgins, who would have fain shrunk back into his house.
"Higgins, thou knowed him. Thou mun go tell the wife. Do it gently, man, but do it quick, for we canna leave him here long."
"I cannot go," said Higgins. "Do not ask me. I cannot face her."
"Thou knows her best," said the man. "When doing a deal and bringing him here, thou take thy share."
"I cannot do it," said Higgins. "I'm welly felled with seeing him. We wasn't friends, and now he's dead."
"Well, if thou want it, thou want it. Someone mun, though."
It's a dree task, but it's a chance every minute as she doesn't hear it in some rougher way, nor a person going to make her let on by degrees, as it were.
Papa, do you go? Said Margaret in a low voice.
If I could, if I had time to think of what I had better say, but all at once.
Margaret saw that her father was indeed unable. He was trembling from head to foot. I will go, said she.
Bless you, miss. It will be a kind act, for she's been but sickly sort of body, I hear, and few hereabouts know much on her.
Margaret knocked at the closed door, but there was such a noise as of many little ill-ordered children that she could hear no reply. Indeed, she doubted if she was heard, and, as every moment of delay made her recoil from her task more and more, she opened the door and went in, shutting it after her, and even, unseen to the woman, fastening the bolt. Mrs. Boucher was sitting in a rocking-chair on the other side of the ill-read-up fireplace. It looked as if the house had been untouched for days by any effort at cleanliness. Margaret said something. She hardly knew what. Her throat and mouth were so dry, and the children's noise completely prevented her from being heard. She tried again. How are you, Mrs. Boucher? But very poorly, I'm afraid. I've no chance of being well, said she querulously. I'm left alone to manage these childer, and not for to give 'em, for to keep 'em quiet. John should not ha' left me, and me so poorly. How long is it since he went away? 4 days sin'. No one would give him work here, and he'd to go on tramp toward Greenfield. But he might have been back afore this, or sent me some word if he'd gotten work. He might. Oh, don't blame him, said Margaret. He felt it deeply, I'm sure. Wilt to hold thy din, and let me hear the laddie speak, addressing herself in no very gentle voice to a little urchin of about a year old. She apologetically continued to Margaret. He's always mithering me for Daddy and Butty, and I had no butties to give him, and Daddy's away, and forgotten us, I think. He's his father's darling, he is, said she, with a sudden turn of mood, and dragging the child up to her knee, she began kissing it fondly. Margaret laid her hand on the woman's arm to arrest her attention. Their eyes met. Poor little fellow, said Margaret slowly. He was his father's darling. He is his father's darling, said the woman, rising hastily and standing face to face with Margaret. Neither of them spoke for a moment or two. Then Mrs. Boucher began in a low, growling tone, gathering in wildness as she went on. He is his father's darling, I say. Poor folk can love their childer as well as rich. Why dunno you speak? Why don't you stare at me with your great pitiful eyes? Where's John? Weak as she was, she shook Margaret to force out an answer. Oh, my God, said she, understanding the meaning of that tearful look. She sank back into the chair. Margaret took up the child and put him into her arms. He loved him, said she. Aye, said the woman, shaking her head. He loved us all. We had someone to love us once. It's a long time ago, but when he were in life and with us, he did love us, he did. He loved this babby mayhappen the best on us. But he loved me, and I loved him, though I was calling him 5 minutes agone. Are you sure he's dead? Said she, trying to get up. If it's only that he's ill and like to die, they may bring him round yet. I'm but an ailing creature myself. I've been ailing this long time. But he is dead. He is drowned. Folk are brought round after they're dead drowned. Whatten was I thinking of, to sit still when I should be stirring myself? Here, whist thee, child, whist thee. Take this, take aught to play with, but do not cry while my heart's breaking. Oh, where is my strength gone to? Oh, John, husband. Margaret saved her from falling by catching her in her arms.
She sat down in the rocking chair and held the woman upon her knees, her head lying on Margaret's shoulder. The other children, clustered together in affright, began to understand the mystery of the scene, but the ideas came slowly, for their brains were dull and languid of perception. They set up such a cry of despair as they guessed the truth that Margaret knew not how to bear it. Johnny's cry was the loudest of them all, though he knew not why he cried, poor little fellow. The mother quivered as she lay in Margaret's arms. Margaret heard a noise at the door. Open it quick," said she to the eldest child. "It's bolted. Make no noise, be very still. Oh, Papa, let them go upstairs very softly and carefully, and perhaps she will not hear them. She has fainted, that's all." "It's as well for her, poor creature," said a woman following in the wake of the bearers of the dead. "But you're not fit to hold her. Stay, I'll run fetch a pillow and we'll let her down easy on the floor." This helpful neighbour was a great relief to Margaret. She was evidently a stranger to the house, a newcomer in the district indeed, but she was so kind and thoughtful that Margaret felt she was no longer needed, and that it would be better, perhaps, to set an example of clearing the house which was filled with idle, if sympathizing, gazers. She looked round for Nicholas Higgins. He was not there, so she spoke to the woman who had taken the lead in placing Mrs. Boucher on the floor. "Can you give all these people a hint that they had better leave in quietness, so that when she comes round, she should only find one or two that she knows about her? Papa, will you speak to the men and get them to go away? She cannot breathe, poor thing, with this crowd about her." Margaret was kneeling down by Mrs. Boucher and bathing her face with vinegar, but in a few minutes she was surprised at the gush of fresh air. She looked round and saw a smile pass between her father and the woman. "What is it?" asked she. "Only our good friend here," replied her father, "hit on a capital expedient for clearing the place. I bid 'em begone, and each take a child with 'em, and to mind that they were orphans, and their mother a widow. It was who could do most, and the childer are sure of a bellyful today and of kindness too. Does who know how he died?" "No," said Margaret. "I could not tell her all at once." "Her mun be told because of the inquest. See, who's coming round? Shall you or I do it, or m'appen your father would be best?" "No, you, said Margaret. They awaited her perfect recovery in silence. Then the neighbour woman sat down on the floor and took Mrs. Boucher's head and shoulders on her lap. "Neighbour," said she, "your man is dead. Guess you how he died?" "He were drowned," said Mrs. Boucher feebly, beginning to cry for the first time at this rough probing of her sorrows. "He were found drowned. He were coming home very hopeless o' aught on earth. He thought God couldna be harder than men, mayhappen not so hard, mayhappen as tender as a mother, mayhappen tenderer. I'm not saying he did right, and I'm not saying he did wrong. All I say is, may neither me nor mine ever have his sore heart, or we may do like things." "He has left me alone with all these children," moaned the widow, less distressed at the manner of the death than Margaret expected, but it was of a piece with her helpless character to feel his loss as principally affecting herself and her children. "Not alone," said Mr. Hale solemnly. "Who is with you? Who will take up your cause?" The widow opened her eyes wide and looked at the new speaker, of whose presence she had not been aware till then. "Who has promised to be a father to the fatherless?" continued he. "But I've getten 6 children, sir, and the eldest not 8 years of age. I'm no meaning for to doubt his power, sir, only it needs a deal of trust." And she began to cry afresh. "Who'll be better able to talk tomorrow, sir?" said the neighbour. "Best comfort now would be the feel of a child at her heart. I'm sorry they took the baby." "I'll go for it," said Margaret. and in a few minutes she returned, carrying Johnny, his face all smeared with eating and his hands loaded with treasures in the shape of shells and bits of crystal and the head of a plaster figure. She placed him in his mother's arms. "There," said the woman. "Now you go. They'll cry together and comfort together, better nor anyone but a child can do. I'll stop with her as long as I'm needed, and if you come tomorrow you can have a deal of wise talk with her, that she's not up to today." As Margaret and her father went slowly up the street, she paused at Higgins' closed door. "Shall we go in?" asked her father. "I was thinking of him too." They knocked. There was no answer, so they tried the door. It was bolted, but they thought they heard him moving within. "Nicholas?" said Margaret. There was no answer, and they might have gone away, believing the house to be empty, if there had not been some accidental fall as of a book within. "Nicholas," said Margaret again, "it is only us. Won't you let us come in?" "No," said he. "I spoke as plain as I could about using words when I bolted the door. Let me be this day." Mr. Hale would have urged their desire, but Margaret placed her finger on his lips. "I don't wonder at it," said she. "I myself long to be alone. It seems the only thing to do one good after a day like this."
So Boucher, right? Wow. When I read it the first time, I didn't see that coming. Going back and doing it again and again, it's a little more telegraphed, and I'm sure a lot of you were expecting it. But were you expecting him to drown himself in just a few inches of water? I mean, that is a stubborn depression right there. And wow. And how sad. The river, which was a public waterway where people probably had to drink from, had been used for dye waste. So his face was dyed, and it was I found it so different, so distant in so many ways from now, because the guys, the neighborhood, brought him, somebody took their door off the hinges and put him on the door and not only walked him to his house, but did you hear? It's like one line that while Mrs. Boucher is passed out, the people take him upstairs. So he's, drying off upstairs now. And one of the things that I didn't mention before we started playing the chapter, because I kind of didn't want to spoil anything overly much, is when Margaret was bathing her forehead, Mrs. Boucher's forehead, in vinegar, I kind of went, what? Because we've done the smelling salts thing during Jane Eyre, remember? And that's kind of an ammonia, not pneumonia. And so the vinegar, what? And I went and looked it up, and I've linked out to a very interesting blog post about how vinegar was used as an aromatic, not just, there are perfumes which people used as aromatics, or flower posies that women would wear to try and stave off the smell of raw sewage out in the world. But vinegars were also used for this, and it was a normal thing to do if somebody fainted, that you could bathe their temples in vinegar to help bring them around. And it was a medicinal. People drank vinegar for various ailments and stuff like that. So there you go. Who knew? I also got a follow-up email to the subdural hematoma that killed the guy who was trying to get Frederick at Dodge. And this came from Paula. She said, regarding North and South, the whole subdural hematoma thing, yeah, that can happen. An old coworker of mine can attest to that. Her mother passed away from a subdural hematoma after being, wait for it, hit on the head with a frying pan by her significant other. He was never charged because she died a full week later. It was a very sad story. They were both alcoholics. There was a lot of abuse going on between them, but my friend was outraged that they couldn't charge him. However, karma had its way with him almost immediately. At the funeral, he looked like a haunted man. He knew what he had done, even if the law couldn't prove it. So what happened in North and South, for me at least, came across as absolutely conceivable. I'm loving the book, by the way. Paula. So thank you, Paula, for writing that in. It's so interesting. There's all this stuff that every once in a while shows up in a book or a movie that you go, oh yeah, that chance. And then you go, oh, really? That happened, huh? It's like when I saw the movie Titanic, two couples, older couples behind me, who were absolutely beside themselves and getting more and more angry at stuff that really happened. Stuff like the kids playing soccer with the chunk of ice that landed on the deck. Well, no, that actually happened. And they really had fits over the band leader playing music, getting some of his band to continue to play music as people were evacuating to try and keep them calm. Because no, that's not right. And yet, so true. And finally I turned around and said, that's true. If you have to complain, at least complain about the lousy dialogue. And it was like I had slapped them. I think at that point I'd been living in New York just long enough to do that. Ah, well, they survived. So did I. So yes, in this chapter, Mr. Hale was once again useless. Although he did eventually show up, and he didn't really know the people in that neighborhood. If he was a parish priest, of course, he would have known everyone, and it would have been much easier to go and announce that somebody's husband had just died. It made some sense for Margaret to go because she at least was familiar with all of the people. But between the conversation with Higgins and the conversation with Mrs. Boucher and Margaret's continuous growth in her ability to kind of take on new and greater responsibilities beyond the scope of what we might imagine a Victorian woman would be able to do, there's something else that's been going on. And I don't know if it's been in the forefront of your mind or if it's been kind of back behind the scenes where it was for me when I went through it the first time. But this is the first chapter where I really noticed that Margaret not only has opinions and not only asks questions, but she's thinking in a distinctly impersonal way. You know, she's really trying to understand the masters in the hands. She's trying to understand the politics of the situation. She's kind of removed herself, which is so not like a Victorian heroine, where most of the time everything is about the family or everything is about your heart or your emotions. She doesn't seem to be particularly emotionally wrecked by any of this stuff. She's got this kind of distance, and it is a fascinating thing to see in a book from this time period. And I think it's one of the things that really attracts people now to this book, because certainly everybody I know who had read this book before, who read it when they were in high school or in college or just stumbled upon it and read it, it's just like The Woman in White. There is some kind of connection that readers today are able to make with Margaret that they may not be able to make with a whole lot of other people. And it's not the same kind of fiery, stubborn, cantankerous, leave me alone, I can do it myself-ness that you get with Jane Eyre. There's another layer of stuff going on here with Margaret, and you're going to continue to see that grow. And it's one of the things that makes the end of this book so good. And on that note, I will leave you this week. Have a great one. I will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
You can find show notes for this episode and links to other episodes at craftlit.com. CraftLit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support CraftLit, from patreon.com/craftlit to craftlit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at craftlit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.
To a Mountain Daisy by Robert Burns, on turning one down with a plough in April 1786. Wee modest crimson-tipped flower, thou's met me in an evil hour, For I maun crash among the stour thy slender stem. To spare thee now is past my power, thy bonny gem. Alas, it is no thy neighbour sweet, the bonny lark companion meet, bending thee mang the dewy wheat wi' sprecked breast, when upward, springing blithe to greet the purpling east. Cold blew the bitter biting north upon thy early humble birth, yet cheerfully thou glinted forth amid the storm, scarce reared above the parent earth thy tender form. The flaunting flowers our gardens yield, high sheltering woods and walls maun shield, but thou beneath the random bield a clod or stain adorns the histy stibble field, unseen, alane. There in thy scanty mantle clad, thy snowy bosom sunward spread, thou lift'st thy unassuming head in humble guise. But now the share uptears thy bed, and low thou lies. Such is the fate of the artless maid, sweet floweret of the rural shade, by love's simplicity betrayed and guileless trust, till she, like thee, all soiled is laid, low i' the dust. Such is the fate of the simple bard, on life's rough ocean luckless starred, unskilful he to note the card of prudent lore, till billows rage and gales blow hard, and whelm a more. Such fate to suffering worth is given, who long wi' wants and woes has striven, by human pride or cunning driven to misery's brink, till wrenched at every stay but heaven, he'd ruined sink. Even thou who mourn'st the daisy's fate, that fate is thine, no distant date. Stern ruin's ploughshares drives elate full on thy bloom, till crushed beneath the furrow's weight shall be thy doom. Standard English Translation. To a Mountain Daisy by Robert Burns, on turning one down with the plough in April 1786. Small, modest, crimson-tipped flower, you have met me in an evil hour, for I must crush thee among the dust, your slender stem. To spare you now is past my power, you lovely gem. Alas, it is not your neighbour sweet, the bonny lark companion meet, bending you amongst the dewy wet with a speckled breast, when upward springing blithe to greet the purpling east. Cold blew the bitter biting north upon your early humble birth, yet cheerfully you sparkled forth amid the storm, scarce reared above the parent earth your tender form. The flaunting flowers our gardens yield, high sheltering woods and walls must shield, but you beneath the random shelter of clod or stone adorns the bare stubble field, unseen, alone. There in your scanty mantle clad, your snowy bosom sunward spread, you lift your unassuming head in humble guise. But now the ploughshare tears up your bed, and low you lie. Such is the fate of artless maid, sweet floweret of the rural shade, by love's simplicity betrayed and guileless trust, until she, like you, all soiled is laid, low in the dust. Such is the fate of simple bard, on life's rough ocean luckless starred, unskilled he note the card of prudent lore, till billows rage and gales blow hard and whelm him over. Such fate to suffering worth is given, who long with wants and woes has striven, by human pride or cunning driven to misery's brink, till wretched of every stay but heaven, he'd ruined sink. Even you who mourns the daisy's fate, that fate is yours, no distant date. Stern ruin's ploughshare drives elate, full on your bloom, till crushed beneath the furrow's weight shall be your doom.